Chapter 9 of Manon Lescaut by Abbe Prevost. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 'Twas ever thus. From childhood's hour I've seen my fondest hopes decay. I never loved a tree or flower, but it was sure to fade away. I never nursed a dear gazelle to glad me with its dark blue eye, but when it came to know me well and love me, it was sure to die. Moore. During my life I have remarked that fate has invariably chosen for the time of its severest visitations those moments when my fortune seemed established on the firmest basis. In the friendship of M. de T and the tender affections of Manon, I imagined myself so thoroughly happy that I could not harbour the slightest apprehension of any new misfortune. There was one, nevertheless, at this very period impending, which reduced me to the state in which you beheld me at Passy, and which eventually brought in its train miseries of so deplorable a nature that you will have difficulty in believing the simple recital that follows. One evening, when M. de T remained to sup with us, we heard the sound of a carriage stopping at the door of the inn. Curiosity tempted us to see who it was that arrived at this hour. They told us it was young G. M., the son of our most vindictive enemy, of that debauched old sinner who had incarcerated me in St. Lazare and Manon in the hospital. His name made the blood mount to my cheeks. "It is Providence that has led him here," said I to M. de T, "that I may punish him for the cowardly baseness of his father. He shall not escape without our measuring swords at least." M. de T, who knew him, and was even one of his most intimate friends, tried to moderate my feelings of anger towards him. He assured me that he was a most amiable young man, and so little capable of countenancing his father's conduct, that I could not be many minutes in his society without feeling esteem and affection for him. After saying many more things in his praise, he begged my permission to invite him to come and sit in our apartment, as well as to share the remainder of our supper. As to the objection of Manon being exposed by this proceeding to any danger, he pledged his honour and good faith, that when once the young man became acquainted with us, we should find in him a most zealous defender. After such an assurance, I could offer no further opposition. M. de T did not introduce him without delaying a few moments outside, to let him know who we were. He certainly came in with an air that prepossessed us in his favour. He shook hands with me. We sat down. He admired Manon. He appeared pleased with me, and with everything that belonged to us, and he ate with an appetite that did abundant honour to our hospitality. When the table was cleared, our conversation became more serious. He hung down his head while he spoke of his father's conduct towards us. He made, on his own part, the most submissive excuses. "I say the less upon the subject," said he, "because I do not wish to recall a circumstance that fills me with grief and shame." If he was sincere in the beginning, he became much more so in the end, for the conversation had not lasted half an hour, when I perceived that Manon's charms had made a visible impression upon him. His looks and his manner became by degrees more tender. He, however, allowed no expression to escape him, but without even the aid of jealousy, I had had experience enough in love affairs to discern what was passing. He remained with us till a late hour in the night, and before he took his leave, congratulated himself on having made our acquaintance, and begged permission to call and renew the offer of his services. He went off next morning with M. de T, who accepted the offer of a seat in his carriage. I felt, as I before said, not the slightest symptom of jealousy. I had a more foolish confidence than ever in Manon's vows. This dear creature had so absolute a dominion over my whole soul and affections, that I could give place to no other sentiment towards her than that of admiration and love. Far from considering it a crime that she should have pleased young G.M., I was gratified by the effect of her charms, and experienced only a feeling of pride in being loved by a girl whom the whole world found so enchanting. I did not even deem it worth while to mention my suspicions to her. We were for some days occupied in arranging her new wardrobe, and in considering whether we might venture to the theatre without the risk of being recognised. Monsieur de T came again to see us before the end of the week, and we consulted him upon this point. He saw clearly that the way to please Manon was to say yes. We resolved to go all together that same evening. We were not able, however, to carry this intention into effect, for, having taken me aside, "I have been in the greatest embarrassment," said he to me, "since I saw you, and that is the cause of my visiting you to-day. G.M. is in love with your mistress. He told me so in confidence. I am his intimate friend, and disposed to do him any service in my power, but I am not less devoted to you. His designs appeared to me unjustifiable, and I expressed my disapprobation of them. I should not have divulged his secret if he had only intended to use fair and ordinary means for gaining Manon's affections, but he is aware of her capricious disposition. He has learned, God knows how, that her ruling passion is for affluence and pleasure, and, as he is already in possession of a considerable fortune, he declared his intention of tempting her at once with a present of great value, and the offer of an annuity of 6,000 francs. If I had in all other points considered you both in an equal light, I should have had perhaps to do more violence to my feelings in betraying him; but a sense of justice as well as of friendship was on your side, and the more so from having been myself the imprudent, though unconscious, cause of his passion in introducing him here. I feel it my duty, therefore, to avert any evil consequences from the mischief I have inadvertently caused." I thanked Monsieur de T for rendering me so important a service, and confessed to him, in a like spirit of confidence, that Manon's disposition was precisely what G.M. had imagined, that is to say, that she was incapable of enduring even the thought of poverty. "However," said I to him, "when it is a mere question of more or less, I do not believe that she would give me up for any other person. I can afford to let her want for nothing, and I have from day to day reason to hope that my fortune will improve. I only dread one thing," continued I, "which is, that G.M. may take unfair advantage of the knowledge he has of our place of residence, and bring us into trouble by disclosing it." Monsieur de T assured me that I might be perfectly easy upon that head; that G.M. might be capable of a silly passion, but not of an act of baseness; that if he ever could be villain enough for such a thing, he, de T, would be the first to punish him, and by that means make reparation for the mischief he had occasioned. "I feel grateful for what you say," said I, "but the mischief will have been all done, and the remedy even seems doubtful. The wisest plan, therefore, will be to quit Chaillot, and go to reside elsewhere." "Very true," said Monsieur de T, "but you will not be able to do it quickly enough, for G.M. is to be here at noon. He told me so yesterday, and it was that intelligence that made me come so early this morning to inform you of his intentions. You may expect him every moment." The urgency of the occasion made me view this matter in a more serious light. As it seemed to me impossible to escape the visit of G.M., and perhaps equally so to prevent him from making his declaration to Manon, I resolved to tell her beforehand of the designs of my new rival. I fancied that when she knew I was aware of the offers that would be made to her, and made probably in my presence, she would be the more likely to reject them. I told M. de T of my intention, and he observed that he thought it a matter of extreme delicacy. "I admit it," said I, "but no man ever had more reason for confiding in a mistress than I have for relying on the affection of mine. The only thing that could possibly for a moment blind her is the splendour of his offers. No doubt she loves her ease, but she loves me also, and in my present circumstances I cannot believe that she would abandon me for the son of the man who had incarcerated her in the Magdalen." In fine, I persisted in my intentions, and taking Manon aside, I candidly told her what I had learned. She thanked me for the good opinion I entertained of her, and promised to receive G M 's offers in a way that should prevent a repetition of them. "No," said I, "you must not irritate him by incivility. He has it in his power to injure us. But you know well enough, you little rogue," continued I, smiling, "how to rid yourself of a disagreeable or useless lover." After a moment's pause, she said, "I have just thought of an admirable plan, and I certainly have a fertile invention. G M is the son of our bitterest enemy. We must avenge ourselves on the father, not through the son's person, but through his purse. My plan is to listen to his proposals, accept his presents, and then laugh at him." "The project is not a bad one," said I to her, "but you forget, my dear child, that it is precisely the same course that conducted us formerly to the penitentiary." I represented to her the danger of such an enterprise. She replied, that the only thing necessary was to take our measures with caution, and she found an answer to every objection I started. Show me the lover who does not blindly humour every whim of an adored mistress, and I will then allow that I was wrong in yielding so easily on this occasion. The resolution was taken to make a dupe of G M, and by an unforeseen and unlucky turn of fortune, I became the victim myself. About 11 o'clock his carriage drove up to the door. He made the most complacent and refined speeches upon the liberty he had taken of coming to dine with us uninvited. He was not surprised at meeting M. de T, who had the night before promised to meet him there, and who had, under some pretext or other, refused a seat in his carriage. Although there was not a single person in the party who was not at heart meditating treachery, we all sat down with an air of mutual confidence and friendship. G M easily found an opportunity of declaring his sentiments to Manon. I did not wish to annoy him by appearing vigilant, so I left the room purposely for several minutes. I perceived on my return that he had not had to encounter any very discouraging austerity on Manon's part, for he was in the best possible spirits. I affected good humour also. He was laughing in his mind at my simplicity, while I was not less diverted by his own. During the whole evening we were thus supplying to each other an inexhaustible fund of amusement. I contrived, before his departure, to let him have Manon for another moment to himself, so that he had reason to applaud my complaisance, as well as the hospitable reception I had given him. As soon as he got into his carriage with M. de T, Manon ran towards me with extended arms, and embraced me, laughing all the while immoderately. She repeated all his speeches and proposals without altering a word. This was the substance. He, of course, adored her, and wished to share with her a large fortune of which he was already in possession, without counting what he was to inherit at his father's death. She should be sole mistress of his heart and fortune, and as an immediate token of his liberality, he was ready at once to supply her with an equipage, a furnished house, a lady's maid, 3 footmen, and a man cook. "There is indeed a son," said I, "very different from his father. But Tell me truly now, does not such an offer tempt you?" "Me?" she replied, adapting to the idea 2 verses from Racine. "Moi? Vous me soupçonnez de cette perfidie? Moi? Je pourrais souffrir un visage odieux qui rappelle toujours l'hôpital à mes yeux." "No," replied I, continuing the parody. "J'aurais peine à penser que l'hôpital, madame, fût un trait dans l'amour lu grave dans votre âme." "But it assuredly is a temptation, a furnished house, a lady's maid, a cook, a carriage, and 3 servants. Gallantry can offer but few more seductive temptations." She protested that her heart was entirely mine, and that it was for the future only open to the impressions I chose to make upon it. "I look upon his promises," said she, "as an instrument for revenge, rather than as a mark of love." I asked her if she thought of accepting the hotel and the carriage. She replied that his money was all she wanted. The difficulty was, how to obtain the one without the other. We resolved to wait for a detailed explanation of the whole project, in a letter which G M promised to write to her, and which in fact she received next morning by a servant out of livery, who, very cleverly, contrived an opportunity of speaking to her alone. She told him to wait for an answer, and immediately brought the letter to me. We opened it together. Passing over the usual commonplace expressions of tenderness, it gave a particular detail of my rival's promises. There were no limits to the expense. He engaged to pay her down 10,000 francs on her taking possession of the hotel, and to supply her expenditure in such a way as that she should never have less than that sum at her command. The appointed day for her entering into possession was close at hand. He only required 2 days for all his preparations, and he mentioned the name of the street and the hotel, where he promised to be in waiting for her in the afternoon of the 2nd day, if she could manage to escape my vigilance. That was the only point upon which he begged of her to relieve his uneasiness. He seemed to be quite satisfied upon every other; but he added that, if she apprehended any difficulty in escaping from me, he could find sure means for facilitating her flight. G M the younger was more cunning than the old gentleman. He wanted to secure his prey before he counted out the cash. We considered what course Manon should adopt. I made another effort to induce her to give up the scheme, and strongly represented all its dangers. Nothing, however, could shake her determination. Her answer to G M was brief, merely assuring him that she could be, without the least difficulty, in Paris on the appointed day, and that he might expect her with certainty. We then resolved that I should instantly hire lodgings in some village on the other side of Paris, and that I should take our luggage with me; that in the afternoon of the following day, which was the time appointed, she should go to Paris; that after receiving G M 's presents, she should earnestly entreat him to take her to the theatre; that she should carry with her as large a portion of the money as she could, and charge my servant with the remainder, for it was agreed that he was to accompany her. He was the man who had rescued her from the Magdalen, and he was devotedly attached to us. I was to be with a hackney coach at the end of the street of St. André des Arts, and to leave it there about 7 o'clock, while I stole, under cover of the twilight, to the door of the theatre. Manon promised to make some excuse for quitting her box for a moment, when she would come down and join me. The rest could be easily done. We were then to return to my hackney coach, and quit Paris by the Faubourg St. Antoine, which was the road to our new residence. This plan, extravagant as it was, appeared to us satisfactorily arranged. But our greatest folly was in imagining that, succeed as we might in its execution, it would be possible for us to escape the consequences. Nevertheless, we exposed ourselves to all risk with the blindest confidence. Manon took her departure with Marcel, so was the servant called. I could not help feeling a pang as she took leave of me. "Manon," said I, "do not deceive me. Will you be faithful to me?" She complained in the tenderest tone of my want of confidence, and renewed all her protestations of eternal love. She was to be in Paris at 3 o'clock. I went some time after. I spent the remainder of the afternoon moping in the Café de Fer, near the Pont Saint Michel. I remained there till nightfall. I then hired a hackney coach, which I placed, according to our plan, at the end of the street of Saint André des Arcs, and went on foot to the door of the theatre. I was surprised at not seeing Marcel, who was to have been there waiting for me. I waited patiently for a full hour, standing among a crowd of lackeys, and gazing at every person that passed. At length, 7 o'clock having struck, without my being able to discover anything or any person connected with our project, I procured a pit ticket in order to ascertain if Manon and G M were in the boxes. Neither one nor the other could I find. I returned to the door, where I again stopped for a quarter of an hour in an agony of impatience and uneasiness. No person appeared, and I went back to the coach, without knowing what to conjecture. The coachman, seeing me, advanced a few paces towards me, and said, with a mysterious air, that a very handsome young person had been waiting more than an hour for me in the coach; that she described me so exactly that he could not be mistaken; and having learned that I intended to return, she said she would enter the coach and wait with patience. I felt confident that it was Manon. I approached. I beheld a very pretty face, certainly, but alas, not hers. The lady asked, in a voice that I had never before heard, whether she had the honour of speaking to the Chevalier des Grieux. I answered, "That is my name." "I have a letter for you," said she, "which will tell you what has brought me here, and by what means I learned your name." I begged she would allow me a few moments to read it in an adjoining café. She proposed to follow me, and advised me to ask for a private room, to which I consented. "Who is the writer of this letter?" I inquired. She referred me to the letter itself. I recognised Manon's hand. This is nearly the substance of the letter. G M had received her with a politeness and magnificence beyond anything she had previously conceived. He had loaded her with the most gorgeous presents. She had the prospect of almost imperial splendour. She assured me, however, that she could not forget me amidst all this magnificence, but that, not being able to prevail on G M to take her that evening to the play, she was obliged to defer the pleasure of seeing me, and that, as a slight consolation for the disappointment which she feared this might cause me, she had found a messenger in one of the loveliest girls in all Paris. She signed herself, "Your loving and constant Manon Lescaut." There was something so cruel and so insulting in the letter, that, what between indignation and grief, I resolutely determined to forget eternally my ungrateful and perjured mistress. I looked at the young woman who stood before me. She was exceedingly pretty, and I could have wished that she had been sufficiently so to render me inconstant in my turn. But there were wanting those lovely and languishing eyes, that divine gracefulness, that exquisite complexion, in fine, those innumerable charms which nature had so profusely lavished upon the perfidious Manon. "No, no," said I, turning away from her. "The ungrateful wretch who sent you knew in her heart that she was sending you on a useless errand. Return to her, and tell her from me to triumph in her crime, and enjoy it if she can, without remorse. I abandon her in despair, and at the same time renounce all women, who, without her fascination, are no doubt her equals in baseness and infidelity. I was then on the point of going away, determined never to bestow another thought on Manon. The mortal jealousy that was racking my heart lay concealed under a dark and sullen melancholy, and I fancied, because I felt none of those violent emotions which I had experienced upon former occasions, that I had shaken off my thraldom. Alas! I was even at that moment infinitely more the dupe of love than of G.M. and Manon. The girl who had brought the letter, seeing me about to depart, asked me what I wished her to say to M. G.M. and to the lady who was with him. At this question I stepped back again into the room, and by one of those unaccountable transitions that are only known to the victims of violent passion, I passed in an instant from the state of subdued tranquillity which I have just described into an ungovernable fury. "Away!" said I to her. "Tell the traitor G.M. and his abandoned mistress the state of despair into which your accursed mission has cast me; but warn them that it shall not be long a source of amusement to them, and that my own hands shall be warmed with the heart's blood of both." I sank back upon a chair, my hat fell on one side, and my cane upon the other. Torrents of bitter tears rolled down my cheeks. The paroxysm of rage changed into a profound and silent grief. I did nothing but weep and sigh. "Approach, my child, approach," said I to the young girl. "Approach, since it is you they have sent to bring me comfort. Tell me whether you have any balm to administer for the pangs of despair and rage, any argument to offer against the crime of self-destruction which I have resolved upon, after ridding the world of two perfidious monsters. Yes, approach," continued I, perceiving that she advanced with timid and doubtful steps. "Come and dry my sorrows. Come and restore peace to my mind. Come and tell me that at least you love me. You are handsome. I may perhaps love you in return." The poor child, who was only 16 or 17 years of age, and who appeared more modest than girls of her class generally are, was thunderstruck at this unusual scene. She however gently approached to caress me, when with uplifted hands I rudely repulsed her. "What do you wish with me?" exclaimed I to her. "Ah, you are a woman, and of a sex I abhor, and can no longer tolerate. The very gentleness of your look threatens me with some new treason. Go, leave me here alone." She made me a curtsey without uttering a word, and turned to go out. I called to her to stop. "Tell me at least," said I, "wherefore, how, with what design they sent you here? How did you discover my name, or the place where you could find me?" She told me that she had long known M. G.M., that he had sent for her that evening about 5 o'clock, and that having followed the servant who had been dispatched to her, she was shown into a large house, where she found him playing at piquet with a beautiful young woman, and that they both charged her to deliver the letter into my hands, after telling her that she would find me in a hackney coach at the bottom of the street of Saint Andre. I asked if they had said nothing more. She blushed while she replied, that they had certainly made her believe that I should be glad of her society. "They have deceived you too," said I, "my poor girl, they have deceived you. You are a woman, and probably wish for a lover, but you must find one who is rich and happy, and it is not here you will find him. Return to M. G.M. He possesses everything requisite to make a man beloved. He has furnished houses and equipages to bestow, while I, who have nothing but constancy of love to offer, am despised for my poverty, and laughed at for my simplicity." I continued in a tone of sorrow or violence, as these feelings alternately took possession of my mind. However, by the very excess of my agitation, I became gradually so subdued as to be able calmly to reflect upon the situation of affairs. I compared this new misfortune with those which I had already experienced of the same kind, and I could not perceive that there was any more reason for despair now than upon former occasions. I knew Manon. Why then distress myself on account of a calamity which I could not but have plainly foreseen? Why not rather think of seeking a remedy? There was yet time. I at least ought not to spare my own exertions, if I wished to avoid the bitter reproach of having contributed by my own indolence to my misery. I thereupon set about considering every means of raising a gleam of hope. To attempt to take her by main force from the hands of G.M. was too desperate a project, calculated only to ruin me, and without the slightest probability of succeeding. But it seemed to me that if I could ensure a moment's interview with her, I could not fail to regain my influence over her affections. I so well knew how to excite her sensibilities. I was so confident of her love for me. The very whim even of sending me a pretty woman by way of consoling me, I would stake my existence was her idea, and that it was the suggestion of her own sincere sympathy for my sufferings. I resolved to exert every nerve to procure an interview. After a multitude of plans, which I canvassed one after another, I fixed upon the following. Monsieur de T had shown so much sincerity in the services he had rendered me, that I could not entertain a doubt of his zeal and good faith. I proposed to call upon him at once, and make him send for G.M. under pretence of some important business. Half an hour would suffice to enable me to see Manon. I thought it would not be difficult to get introduced into her apartment during G.M.'s absence. This determination pacified me, and I gave a liberal present to the girl who was still with me, and in order to prevent her from returning to those who had sent her, I took down her address, and half promised to call upon her at a later hour. I then got into the hackney coach and drove quickly to Monsieur de T.'s. I was fortunate enough to find him at home. I had been apprehensive upon this point as I went along. A single sentence put him in possession of the whole case, as well of my sufferings as of the friendly service I had come to supplicate at his hands. He was so astonished to learn that G.M. had been able to seduce Manon from me, that, not being aware that I had myself lent a hand to my own misfortune, he generously offered to assemble his friends, and evoke their aid for the deliverance of my mistress. I told him that such a proceeding might by its publicity be attended with danger to Manon and to me. "Let us risk our lives," said I, "only as a last resource. My plan is of a more peaceful nature, and promising at least equal success." He entered without a murmur into all that I proposed. So, again stating that all I required was, that he should send for G.M., and contrive to keep him an hour or two from home, we at once set about our operations. We first of all considered what expedient we could make use of for keeping him out so long a time. I proposed that he should write a note dated from a cafe, begging of him to come there as soon as possible, upon an affair of too urgent importance to admit of delay. "I will watch," added I, "the moment he quits the house, and introduce myself without any difficulty, being only known to Manon and my servant Marcel. You can at the same time tell G.M. that the important affair upon which you wished to see him was the immediate want of a sum of money, that you had just emptied your purse at play, and that you had played on, with continued bad luck, upon credit. He will require some time to take you to his father's house, where he keeps his money, and I shall have quite sufficient for the execution of my plan." Monsieur de T minutely adhered to these directions. I left him in a cafe, where he at once wrote his letter. I took my station close by Manon's house. I saw de T.'s messenger arrive, and G.M. come out the next moment, followed by a servant. Allowing him barely time to get out of the street, I advanced to my deceiver's door, and, notwithstanding the anger I felt, I knocked with as much respect as at the portal of a church. Fortunately, it was Marcel who opened for me. Although I had nothing to apprehend from the other servants, I asked him in a low voice if he could conduct me unseen into the room in which Manon was. He said that was easily done, by merely ascending the great staircase. "Come then at once," said I to him, "and endeavour to prevent any one from coming up while I am there." I reached the apartment without any difficulty. Manon was reading. I had there an opportunity of admiring the singular character of this girl. Instead of being nervous or alarmed at my appearance, she scarcely betrayed a symptom of surprise, which few persons, however indifferent, could restrain on seeing one whom they imagined to be far distant. "Ah, it is you, my dear love," said she, approaching to embrace me with her usual tenderness. "Good heavens, how venturesome and foolhardy you are! Who could have expected to see you in this place?" Instead of embracing her in return, I repulsed her with indignation, and retreated 2 or 3 paces from her. This evidently disconcerted her. She remained immovable, and fixed her eyes on me, while she changed colour. I was, in reality, so delighted to behold her once more, that, with so much real cause for anger, I could hardly bring my lips to upbraid her. My heart, however, felt the cruel outrage she had inflicted upon me. I endeavoured to revive the recollection of it in my own mind, in order to excite my feelings, and put on a look of stern indignation. I remained silent for a few moments, when I remarked that she observed my agitation, and trembled, apparently the effect of her fears. I could not longer endure this spectacle. "Ah, Manon," said I to her in the mildest tone, "faithless and perjured Manon, how am I to complain of your conduct? I see you pale and trembling, and I am still so much alive to your slightest sufferings, that I am unwilling to add to them by my reproaches. But, Manon, I tell you that my heart is pierced with sorrow at your treatment of me, treatment that is seldom inflicted but with the purpose of destroying one's life. This is the 3rd time, Manon. I have kept a correct account. It is impossible to forget that. It is now for you to consider what course you will adopt, for my afflicted heart is no longer capable of sustaining such shocks. I know and feel that it must give way, and it is at this moment ready to burst with grief. I can say no more," added I, throwing myself into a chair. "I have hardly strength to speak or to support myself." She made me no reply, but when I was seated, she sank down upon her knees, and rested her head upon my lap, covering her face with her hands. I perceived in a moment that she was shedding floods of tears. Heavens! With what conflicting sensations was I at that instant agitated! "Ah, Manon, Manon!" said I, sighing, "it is too late to give me tears after the death blow you have inflicted. You affect a sorrow which you cannot feel. The greatest of your misfortunes is no doubt my presence, which has been always an obstacle to your happiness. Open your eyes, look up and see who it is that is here. You will not throw away tears of tenderness upon an unhappy wretch whom you have betrayed and abandoned." She kissed my hands without changing her position. "Inconstant Manon," said I again, "ungrateful and faithless girl, where now are all your promises and your vows? Capricious and cruel that you are, What has now become of the love that you protested for me this very day?' "'Just heavens!' added I. 'Is it thus you permit a traitor to mock you, after having called you so solemnly to witness her vows? Recompense and reward, then, are for the perjured. Despair and neglect are the lot of fidelity and truth.' These words conveyed even to my own mind a sentiment so bitterly severe, that, in spite of myself, some tears escaped from me. Manon perceived this by the change in my voice. She at length spoke. 'I must have indeed done something most culpable,' said she, sobbing with grief, 'to have excited and annoyed you to this degree. But I call Heaven to attest my utter unconsciousness of crime, and my innocence of all criminal intention.' This speech struck me as so devoid of reason and of truth, that I could not restrain a lively feeling of anger. 'Horrible hypocrisy!' cried I. 'I see more plainly than ever that you are dishonest and treacherous. Now at length I learn your wretched disposition. Adieu, base creature,' said I, rising from my seat. 'I would prefer death 1,000 times, rather than continue to hold the slightest communication with you. May Heaven punish me, if I ever again waste upon you the smallest regard. Live on with your new lover, renounce all feelings of honour, detest me. Your love is now a matter to me of utter insignificance.' Manon was so terrified by the violence of my anger, that, remaining on her knees by the chair from which I had just before risen, breathless and trembling, she fixed her eyes upon me. I advanced a little farther towards the door, but unless I had lost the last spark of humanity, I could not continue longer unmoved by such a spectacle. So far indeed was I from this kind of stoical indifference, that, rushing at once into the very opposite extreme, I returned, or rather flew back to her without an instant's reflection. I lifted her in my arms, I gave her 1,000 tender kisses, I implored her to pardon my ungovernable temper. I confessed that I was an absolute brute, and unworthy of being loved by such an angel. I made her sit down, and throwing myself in my turn upon my knees, I conjured her to listen to me in that attitude. Then I briefly expressed all that a submissive and impassioned lover could say most tender and respectful. I supplicated her pardon. She let her arms fall over my neck, as she said that it was she who stood in need of forgiveness, and begged of me in mercy to forget all the annoyances she had caused me, and that she began, with reason, to fear that I should not approve of what she had to say in her justification. 'Me!' said I, interrupting her impatiently. 'I require no justification. I approve of all you have done. It is not for me to demand excuses for anything you do. I am but too happy, too contented, if my dear Manon will only leave me master of her affections. But,' continued I, remembering that it was the crisis of my fate, 'may I not, Manon, all-powerful Manon, you who wield at your pleasure my joys and sorrows, may I not be permitted, after having conciliated you by my submission and all the signs of repentance, to speak to you now of my misery and distress? May I now learn from your own lips what my destiny is to be, and whether you are resolved to sign my death warrant by spending even a single night with my rival?' She considered a moment before she replied. 'My good chevalier,' said she, resuming the most tranquil tone, 'if you had only at first explained yourself thus distinctly, you would have spared yourself a world of trouble, and prevented a scene that has really annoyed me. Since your distress is the result of jealousy, I could at first have cured that by offering to accompany you where you pleased. But I imagined it was caused by the letter which I was obliged to write in the presence of G.M. and of the girl whom we sent with it. I thought you might have construed that letter into a mockery, and have fancied that, by sending such a messenger, I meant to announce my abandonment of you for the sake of G.M. It was this idea that at once overwhelmed me with grief, for, innocent as I knew myself to be, I could not but allow that appearances were against me. However," continued she, "I will leave you to judge of my conduct after I shall have explained the whole truth." She then told me all that had occurred to her after joining G.M., whom she found punctually awaiting her arrival. He had, in fact, received her in the most princely style. He showed her through all the apartments, which were fitted up in the neatest and most correct taste. He had counted out to her in her boudoir 10,000 francs, as well as a quantity of jewels, amongst which were the identical pearl necklace and bracelets which she had once before received as a present from his father. He then led her into a splendid room, which she had not before seen, and in which an exquisite collation was served. She was waited upon by the new servants, whom he had hired purposely for her, and whom he now desired to consider themselves as exclusively her attendants. The carriage and the horses were afterwards paraded, and he then proposed a game of cards until supper should be announced. "I acknowledge," continued Manon, "that I was dazzled by all this magnificence. It struck me that it would be madness to sacrifice at once so many good things for the mere sake of carrying off the money and the jewels already in my possession; that it was a certain fortune made for both you and me, and that we might pass the remainder of our lives most agreeably and comfortably at the expense of G.M. Instead of proposing the theatre, I thought it more prudent to sound his feelings with regard to you, in order to ascertain what facilities we should have for meeting in future, on the supposition that I could carry my project into effect. I found him of a most tractable disposition. He asked me how I felt towards you, and if I had not experienced some compunction at quitting you. I told him that you were so truly amiable, and had ever treated me with such undeviating kindness, that it was impossible I could hate you. He admitted that you were a man of merit, and expressed an ardent desire to gain your friendship. He was anxious to know how I thought you would take my elopement, particularly when you should learn that I was in his hands. I answered that our love was of such long standing as to have had time to moderate a little, that, besides, you were not in very easy circumstances, and would probably not consider my departure as any severe misfortune, inasmuch as it would relieve you from a burden of no very insignificant nature. I added that, being perfectly convinced you would take the whole matter rationally, I had not hesitated to tell you that I had some business in Paris, but you had at once consented, and that, having accompanied me yourself, you did not seem very uneasy when we separated. If I thought," said he to me, "that he could bring himself to live on good terms with me, I should be too happy to make him a tender of my services and attentions." I assured him that, from what I knew of your disposition, I had no doubt you would acknowledge his kindness in a congenial spirit, especially, I added, if he could assist you in your affairs, which had become embarrassed since your disagreement with your family. He interrupted me by declaring that he would gladly render you any service in his power, and that, if you were disposed to form a new attachment, he would introduce you to an extremely pretty woman, whom he had just given up for me. I approved of all he said, she added, for fear of exciting any suspicions, and being more and more satisfied of the feasibility of my scheme, I only longed for an opportunity of letting you into it, lest you should be alarmed at my not keeping my appointment. With this view, I suggested the idea of sending this young lady to you, in order to have an opportunity of writing. I was obliged to have recourse to this plan, because I could not see a chance of his leaving me to myself for a moment. He was greatly amused with my proposition. He called his valet, and asking him whether he could immediately find his late mistress, he dispatched him at once in search of her. He imagined that she would have to go to Chaillot to meet you, but I told him that, when we parted, I promised to meet you again at the theatre, or that, if anything should prevent me from going there, you were to wait for me in a coach at the end of the street of Saint Andre; that consequently it would be best to send your new love there, if it were only to save you from the misery of suspense during the whole night. I said it would be also necessary to write you a line of explanation, without which you would probably be puzzled by the whole transaction. He consented, but I was obliged to write in his presence, and I took especial care not to explain matters too palpably in my letter. "This is the history," said Manon, "of the entire affair. I conceal nothing from you, of either my conduct or my intentions. The girl arrived. I thought her handsome, and as I doubted not that you would be mortified by my absence, I did most sincerely hope that she would be able to dissipate something of your ennui, for it is the fidelity of the heart alone that I value. I should have been too delighted to have sent Marcel, but I could not for a single instant find an opportunity of telling him what I wished to communicate to you." She finished her story by describing the embarrassment into which Monsieur de T 's letter had thrown G M. "He hesitated," said she, "about leaving, and assured me that he should not be long absent; and it is on this account that I am uneasy at seeing you here, and that I betrayed at your appearance some slight feeling of surprise." I listened to her with great patience. There were certainly parts of her recital sufficiently cruel and mortifying; for the intention, at least, of the infidelity was so obvious that she had not even taken the trouble to disguise it. She could never have imagined that G M meant to venerate her as a vestal. She must therefore clearly have made up her mind to pass at least one night with him. What an avowal for a lover's ears! However, I considered myself as partly the cause of her guilt, by having been the first to let her know G M.'s sentiments towards her, and by the silly readiness with which I entered into this rash project. Besides, by a natural bent of my mind, peculiar I believe to myself, I was duped by the ingenuousness of her story, by that open and winning manner with which she related even the circumstances most calculated to annoy me. "There is nothing of wanton vice," said I to myself, "in her transgressions. She is volatile and imprudent, but she is sincere and affectionate. My love alone rendered me blind to all her faults. I was enchanted at the prospect of rescuing her that very night from my rival. I said to her, 'With whom do you mean to pass the night?' She was evidently disconcerted by the question, and answered me in an embarrassed manner with buts and ifs. I felt for her, and interrupted her by saying that I at once expected her to accompany me. 'Nothing can give me more pleasure,' said she. 'But you don't approve then of my project?' 'Is it not enough,' replied I, 'that I approve of all that you have up to this moment done?' 'What!' said she, 'are we not even to take the 10,000 francs with us? Why, he gave me the money; it is mine.' I advised her to leave everything, and let us think only of escaping; for although I had been hardly half an hour with her, I began to dread the return of G M. However, she so earnestly urged me to consent to our going out with something in our pockets, that I thought myself bound to make her, on my part, some concession, in return for all she yielded to me. While we were getting ready for our departure, I heard someone knock at the street door. I felt convinced that it must be G.M., and in the heat of the moment I told Manon that as sure as he appeared, I would take his life. In truth, I felt that I was not sufficiently recovered from my late excitement to be able to restrain my fury if I met him. Marcel put an end to my uneasiness by handing me a letter which he had received for me at the door. It was from Monsieur de T. He told me that, as G.M. had gone to his father's house for the money which he wanted, he had taken advantage of his absence to communicate to me an amusing idea that had just come into his head; that it appeared to him I could not possibly take a more agreeable revenge upon my rival than by eating his supper and spending the night in the very bed which he had hoped to share with my mistress. All this seemed to him easy enough, if I could only find 2 or 3 men upon whom I could depend, of courage sufficient to stop him in the street, and detain him in custody until next morning; that he would undertake to keep him occupied for another hour at least, under some pretext which he could devise before G.M.'s return. I showed the note to Manon. I told her at the same time of the manner in which I had procured the interview with her. My scheme, as well as the new one of M. de T.'s, delighted her. We laughed heartily at it for some minutes, but when I treated it as a mere joke, I was surprised at her insisting seriously upon it, as a thing perfectly practicable, and too delightful to be neglected. In vain I inquired where she thought I could possibly find, on a sudden, men fit for such an adventure, and on whom I could rely for keeping G.M. in strict custody. She said that I should at least try, as M. de T ensured us yet a full hour; and as to my other objections, she said that I was playing the tyrant, and did not show the slightest indulgence to her fancies. She said that it was impossible there could be a more enchanting project. "You will have his place at supper, you will sleep in his bed, and tomorrow, as early as you like, you can walk off with both his mistress and his money. You may thus at one blow be amply revenged upon father and son." I yielded to her entreaties, in spite of the secret misgivings of my own mind, which seemed to forebode the unhappy catastrophe that afterwards befell me. I went out with the intention of asking 2 or 3 guardsmen, with whom Lescaut had made me acquainted, to undertake the arrest of G.M. I found only one of them at home, but he was a fellow ripe for any adventure, and he no sooner heard our plan than he assured me of certain success. All he required were 6 pistoles to reward the 3 private soldiers whom he determined to employ in the business. I begged of him to lose no time. He got them together in less than a quarter of an hour. I waited at his lodgings till he returned with them, and then conducted him to the corner of a street through which I knew G.M. must pass in going back to Manon's house. I requested him not to treat G.M. roughly, but to keep him confined, and so strictly watched, until 7 o'clock next morning, that I might be free from all apprehension of his escape. He told me his intention was to bring him a prisoner to his own room, and make him undress and sleep in his bed, while he and his gallant comrades should spend the night in drinking and playing. I remained with them until we saw G.M. returning homewards, and I then withdrew a few steps into a dark recess in the street, to enjoy so entertaining and extraordinary a scene. The officer challenged him with a pistol to his breast, and then told him, in a civil tone, that he did not want either his money or his life, but that if he hesitated to follow him, or if he gave the slightest alarm, he would blow his brains out. G.M., seeing that his assailant was supported by 3 soldiers, and perhaps not uninfluenced by a dread of the pistol, yielded without further resistance. I saw him led away like a lamb. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Manon Lescaut by Abbe Prevost. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What lost a world and bade a hero fly? The timid tear in Cleopatra's eye. Yet be the soft triumvir's fault forgiven. By this how many lose not earth but heaven, consign their souls to man's eternal foe, and seal their own to spare some wanton's woe. Byron. I soon returned to Manon, and to prevent the servants from having any suspicion, I told her, in their hearing, that she need not expect Monsieur G.M. to supper, that he was most reluctantly occupied with business which detained him, and that he had commissioned me to come and make his excuses, and to fill his place at the supper table, which, in the company of so beautiful a lady, I could not but consider a very high honour. She seconded me with her usual adroitness. We sat down to supper. I put on the most serious air I could assume while the servants were in the room, and at length, having got rid of them, we passed beyond all comparison the most agreeable evening of my life. I gave Marcel orders to find a hackney coach, and engage it to be at the gate on the following morning, a little before 6 o'clock. I pretended to take leave of Manon about midnight, but easily gaining admission again, through Marcel, I proceeded to occupy G.M.'s bed, as I had filled his place at the supper table. In the meantime our evil genius was at work for our destruction. We were like children, enjoying the success of our silly scheme, while the sword hung suspended over our heads. The thread which upheld it was just about to break. But the better to understand all the circumstances of our ruin, it is necessary to know the immediate cause. G.M. was followed by a servant when he was stopped by my friend the guardsman. Alarmed by what he saw, this fellow retraced his steps, and the first thing he did was to go and inform old G.M. of what had just happened. Such a piece of news of course excited him greatly. This was his only son, and, considering the old gentleman's advanced age, he was extremely active and ardent. He first enquired of the servant what his son had been doing that afternoon, whether he had had any quarrel on his own account, or interfered in any other, whether he had been in any suspicious house. The lackey, who fancied his master in imminent danger, and thought he ought not to have any reserve in such an emergency, disclosed at once all that he knew of his connection with Manon, and of the expense he had gone to on her account, the manner in which he had passed the afternoon with her until about 9 o'clock, the circumstance of his leaving her, and the outrage he encountered on his return. This was enough to convince him that his son's affair was a love quarrel. Although it was then at least 10:30 at night, he determined at once to call on the lieutenant of police. He begged of him to issue immediate orders to all the detachments that were out on duty, and he himself, taking some men with him, hastened to the street where his son had been stopped. He visited every place where he thought he might have a chance of finding him, and not being able to discover the slightest trace of him, he went off to the house of his mistress, to which he thought he probably might by this time have returned. I was stepping into bed when he arrived. The door of the chamber being closed, I did not hear the knock at the gate, but he rushed into the house, accompanied by 2 archers of the guard, and after fruitless enquiries of the servants about his son, he resolved to try whether he could get any information from their mistress. He came up to the apartment, still accompanied by the guard. We were just on the point of lying down, when he burst open the door, and electrified us by his appearance. "Heavens!" said I to Manon, "it is old G.M." I attempted to get possession of my sword, but it was fortunately entangled in my belt. The archers, who saw my object, advanced to lay hold of me. Stripped to my shirt, I could of course offer no resistance, and they speedily deprived me of all means of defence. G.M., although a good deal embarrassed by the whole scene, soon recognised me, and Manon still more easily. "Is this a dream?" said he in the most serious tone. "Do I not see before me the Chevalier des Grieux and Manon Lescaut?" I was so overcome with shame and disappointment that I could make him no reply. He appeared for some minutes revolving different thoughts in his mind, and, as if they had suddenly excited his anger, he exclaimed, addressing himself to me, "Wretch! I am confident that you have murdered my son." I felt indignant at so insulting a charge. "You hoary and lecherous villain!" I exclaimed. "If I had been inclined to kill any of your worthless family, it is with you I should most assuredly have commenced." "Hold him fast," cried he to the archers. "He must give me some tidings of my son. I shall have him hanged to-morrow, if he does not presently let me know how he has disposed of him." "You will have me hanged?" said I. "Will you? Infamous scoundrel! It is for such as you that the gibbet is erected. Know that the blood which flows in my veins is noble, and purer in every sense than yours. Yes," I added, "I do know what has happened to your son, and if you irritate me further, I will have him strangled before morning, and I promise you the consolation of meeting in your own person the same fate after he is disposed of." I was imprudent in acknowledging that I knew where his son was, but excess of anger made me commit this indiscretion. He immediately called in 5 or 6 other archers who were waiting at the gate, and ordered them to take all the servants into custody. "Aha, chevalier!" said he in a tone of sardonic raillery, "so you do know where my son is, and you will have him strangled, you say? We will try to set that matter to rights." I now saw the folly I had committed. He approached Manon, who was sitting upon the bed, bathed in a flood of tears. He said something, with the most cruel irony, of the despotic power she wielded over old and young, father and son, her edifying dominion over her empire. This superannuated monster of incontinence actually attempted to take liberties with her. "Take care," exclaimed I, "how you lay a finger upon her. Neither divine nor human law will be able, should your folly arouse it, to shield you from my vengeance." He quitted the room, desiring the archers to make us dress as quickly as possible. I know not what were his intentions at that moment with regard to us. We might perhaps have regained our liberty if we had told him where his son was. As I dressed, I considered whether this would not be the wisest course. But if, on quitting the room, such had been the disposition of his mind, it was very different when he returned. He had first gone to question Manon's servants, who were in the custody of the guard. From those who had been expressly hired for her service by his son, he could learn nothing. But when he found that Marcel had been previously our servant, he determined to extract some information from him by means of intimidation, threats, or bribes. This lad was faithful, but weak and unsophisticated. The remembrance of what he had done at the penitentiary for Manon's release, joined to the terror with which G.M. now inspired him, so subdued his mind that he thought they were about leading him to the gallows or the rack. He promised that, if they would spare his life, he would disclose everything he knew. This speech made G.M. imagine that there was something more serious in the affair than he had before supposed. He not only gave Marcel a promise of his life, but a handsome reward in hand for his intended confession. The booby then told him the leading features of our plot, of which we had made no secret before him, as he was himself to have borne a part in it. True, he knew nothing of the alterations we had made at Paris in our original design, but he had been informed, before quitting Chaillot, of our projected adventure, and of the part he was to perform. He therefore told him that the object was to make a dupe of his son, and that Manon was to receive, if she had not already received, 10,000 francs, which, according to our project, would be effectually lost to G.M., his heirs and assigns, for ever. Having acquired this information, the old gentleman hastened back in a rage to the apartment. Without uttering a word, he passed into the boudoir, where he easily put his hand upon the money and the jewels. He then accosted us, bursting with rage, and holding up what he was pleased to call our plunder, he loaded us with the most indignant reproaches. He placed close to Manon's eye the pearl necklace and bracelets. "Do you recognise them?" said he in a tone of mockery. "It is not perhaps the first time you may have seen them. The identical pearls, by my faith! They were selected by your own exquisite taste. The poor innocents," added he, "they really are most amiable creatures, both one and the other, but they are perhaps a little too much inclined to roguery." I could hardly contain my indignation at this speech. I would have given for one moment's liberty. Heavens, what would I not have given? At length I suppressed my feelings sufficiently to say in a tone of moderation, which was but the refinement of rage, "Put an end, sir, to this insolent mockery. What is your object? What do you propose doing with us?" "Monsieur Chevalier," he answered, "my object is to see you quietly lodged in the prison of Le Châtelet. To-morrow will bring daylight with it, and we shall then be able to take a clearer view of matters, and I hope you will at last do me the favour to let me know where my son is." It did not require much consideration to feel convinced that our incarceration in Le Châtelet would be a serious calamity. I foresaw all the dangers that would ensue. In spite of my pride, I plainly saw the necessity of bending before my fate, and conciliating my most implacable enemy by submission. I begged of him in the quietest manner to listen to me. "I wish to do myself but common justice, sir," said I to him. "I admit that my youth has led me into egregious follies, and that you have had fair reason to complain. But if you have ever felt the resistless power of love, if you can enter into the sufferings of an unhappy young man, from whom all that he most loved was ravished, you may think me perhaps not so culpable in seeking the gratification of an innocent revenge, or at least you may consider me sufficiently punished by the exposure and degradation I have just now endured. Neither pains nor imprisonment will be requisite to make me tell you where your son now is. He is in perfect safety. It was never my intention to injure him, nor to give you just cause for offence. I am ready to let you know the place where he is safely passing the night, if, in return, you will set us at liberty." The old tiger, far from being softened by my prayer, turned his back upon me and laughed. A few words escaped him, which showed that he perfectly well knew our whole plan from the commencement. As for his son, the brute said that he would easily find him, since I had not assassinated him. "Conduct them to the Petit Châtelet," said he to the archers, "and take especial care that the Chevalier does not escape you. He is a scamp that once before escaped from Saint Lazare." He went out and left me in a condition that you may picture to yourself. "Oh heavens!" cried I to myself, "I receive with humble submission all your visitations, but that a wretched scoundrel should thus have the power to tyrannize over me, this it is that plunges me into the depths of despair." The archers begged that we would not detain them any longer. They had a coach at the door. "Come, my dear angel," said I to Manon as we went down. "Come, let us submit to our destiny in all its rigour. It may one day please Heaven to render us more happy." We went in the same coach. I supported her in my arms. I had not heard her utter a single word since G.M.'s first appearance. But now, finding herself alone with me, she addressed me in the tenderest manner, and accused herself of being the cause of all my troubles. I assured her that I never could complain, while she continued to love me. "It is not I that have reason to complain," I added. "Imprisonment for a few months has no terrors for me, and I would infinitely prefer Le Châtelet to St. Lazare. But it is for you, my dearest soul, that my heart bleeds. What a lot for such an angel! How can you, gracious Heaven, subject to such rigour the most perfect work of your own hands? Why are we not both of us born with qualities conformable to our wretched condition? We are endowed with spirit, with taste, with feeling, while the vilest of God's creatures, brutes alone worthy of our unhappy fate, are revelling in all the favours of fortune." These feelings filled me with grief, but it was bliss compared with my prospects for the future. My fear on account of Manon knew no bounds. She had already been an inmate of the Magdalen, and even if she had left it by fair means, I knew that a relapse of this nature would be attended with disastrous consequences. I wished to let her know my fears. I was apprehensive of exciting hers. I trembled for her, without daring to put her on her guard against the danger, and I embraced her tenderly to satisfy her at least of my love, which was almost the only sentiment to which I dared to give expression. "Manon," said I, "tell me sincerely, will you ever cease to love me?" She answered that it made her unhappy to think that I could doubt it. "Very well," replied I do so no longer, and with this conviction I may well defy all my enemies. Through the influence of my family, I can ensure my own liberation from the Châtelet, and my life will be of little use and of short duration if I do not succeed in rescuing you." We arrived at the prison, where they put us into separate cells. This blow was the less severe because I was prepared for it. I recommended Manon to the attention of the porter, telling him that I was a person of some distinction, and promising him a considerable recompense. I embraced my dearest mistress before we parted. I implored her not to distress herself too much, and to fear nothing while I lived. I had money with me. I gave her some, and I paid the porter out of what remained the amount of a month's expenses for both of us in advance. This had an excellent effect, for I found myself placed in an apartment comfortably furnished, and they assured me that Manon was in one equally good. I immediately set about devising the means of procuring my liberty. There certainly had been nothing actually criminal in my conduct, and supposing even that our felonious intention was established by the evidence of Marcel, I knew that criminal intentions alone were not punishable. I resolved to write immediately to my father, and beg of him to come himself to Paris. I felt much less humiliation, as I have already said, in being in Le Châtelet than in St. Lazare. Besides, although I preserved all proper respect for the paternal authority, age and experience had considerably lessened my timidity. I wrote, and they made no difficulty in the prison about forwarding my letter. But it was a trouble I should have spared myself, had I known that my father was about to arrive on the following day in Paris. He had received the letter I had written to him a week before. It gave him extreme delight; but, notwithstanding the flattering hopes I had held out of my conversion, he could not implicitly rely on my statements. He determined therefore to satisfy himself of my reformation by the evidence of his own senses, and to regulate his conduct towards me according to his conviction of my sincerity. He arrived the day after my imprisonment. His first visit was to Tiberge, to whose care I begged that he would address his answer. He could not learn from him either my present abode or condition. Tiberge merely told him of my principal adventures since I had escaped from St. Lazare. Tiberge spoke warmly of the disposition to virtue which I had evinced at our last interview. He added that he considered me as having quite got rid of Manon, but that he was nevertheless surprised at my not having given him any intelligence about myself for a week. My father was not to be duped. He fully comprehended that there was something in the silence of which Tiberge complained, which had escaped my poor friend's penetration, and he took such pains to find me out, that in 2 days after his arrival he learned that I was in Le Châtelet. Before I received this visit, which I little expected so soon, I had the honour of one from the Lieutenant General of Police, or, to call things by their right names, I was subjected to an official examination. He upbraided me, certainly, but not in any harsh or annoying manner. He told me in the kindest tone that he bitterly lamented my bad conduct, that I had committed a gross indiscretion in making an enemy of such a man as Monsieur G.M., that in truth it was easy to see that there was in the affair more of imprudence and folly than of malice, but that still it was the second time I had been brought as a culprit under his cognizance, and that he had hoped I should have become more sedate after the experience of 2 or 3 months in St. Lazare. Delighted at finding that I had a rational judge to deal with, I explained the affair to him in a manner at once so respectful and so moderate, that he seemed exceedingly satisfied with my answers to all the queries he put. He desired me not to abandon myself to grief, and assured me that he felt every disposition to serve me, as well on account of my birth as my inexperience. I ventured to bespeak his attentions in favour of Manon, and I dwelt upon her gentle and excellent disposition. He replied, with a smile, that he had not yet seen her, but that she had been represented to him as a most dangerous person. This expression so excited my sympathy, that I urged 1,000 anxious arguments in favour of my poor mistress, and I could not restrain even from shedding tears. He desired them to conduct me back to my chamber. "Love, love," cried this grave magistrate as I went out, "thou art never to be reconciled with discretion." I had been occupied with the most melancholy reflections, and was thinking of the conversation I had had with the Lieutenant General of Police, when I heard my door open. It was my father. Although I ought to have been half prepared for seeing him, and had reasons to expect his arrival within a day or 2, yet I was so thunderstruck that I could willingly have sunk into the earth if it had been open at my feet. I embraced him in the greatest possible state of confusion. He took a seat without either one or other of us having uttered a word. As I remained standing, with my head uncovered and my eyes cast on the ground, "Be seated, sir," said he in a solemn voice. "Be seated. I have to thank the notoriety of your debaucheries for learning the place of your abode. It is the privilege of such fame as yours that it cannot lie concealed. You are acquiring celebrity by an unerring path. Doubtless it will lead you to the grave, and you will then have the unfading glory of being held up to the admiration of the world." I made no reply. He continued, "What an unhappy lot is that of a father, who, having tenderly loved a child, and strained every nerve to bring him up a virtuous and respectable man, finds him turn out in the end a worthless profligate, who dishonours him. To an ordinary reverse of fortune one may be reconciled. Time softens the affliction, and even the indulgence of sorrow itself is not unavailing. But what remedy is there for an evil that is perpetually augmenting, such as the profligacy of a vicious son, who has deserted every principle of honour, and is ever plunging from deep into deeper vice?" You are silent," added he. "Look at this counterfeit modesty, this hypocritical air of gentleness. Might he not pass for the most respectable member of his family?" Although I could not but feel that I deserved in some degree these reproaches, yet he appeared to me to carry them beyond all reason. I thought I might be permitted to explain my feelings. "I assure you, sir," said I to him, "that the modesty which you ridicule is by no means affected. It is the natural feeling of a son who entertains sincere respect for his father, and above all a father irritated as you justly are by his faults. Neither have I, sir, the slightest wish to pass for the most respectable member of my family. I know that I have merited your reproaches, but I conjure you to temper them with mercy, and not to look upon me as the most infamous of mankind. I do not deserve such harsh names. It is love, you know it, that has caused all my errors. Fatal passion! Have you yourself never felt its force? Is it possible that you, with the same blood in your veins that flows in mine, should have passed through life unscathed by the same excitements? Love has rendered me perhaps foolishly tender, too easily excited, too impassioned, too faithful, and probably too indulgent to the desires and caprices, or, if you will, the faults of an adored mistress. These are my crimes. Are they such as to reflect dishonour upon you? Come, my dear father," said I tenderly, "show some pity for a son who has never ceased to feel respect and affection for you, who has not renounced, as you say, all feelings of honour and of duty, and who is himself 1,000 times more an object of pity than you imagine." I could not help shedding a tear as I concluded this appeal. A father's heart is a chef d'oeuvre of creation. There nature rules in undisturbed dominion, and regulates at will its most secret springs. He was a man of high feeling and good taste, and was so sensibly affected by the turn I had given to my defence, that he could no longer hide from me the change I had wrought. "Come to me, my poor chevalier," said he. "Come and embrace me. I do pity you." I embraced him. He pressed me to him in such a manner that I guessed what was passing in his heart. "But how are we," said he, "to extricate you from this place? Explain to me the real situation of your affairs." As there really was not anything in my conduct so grossly improper as to reflect dishonour upon me, at least in comparison with the conduct of other young men of a certain station in the world, and as a mistress is not considered a disgrace any more than a little dexterity in drawing some advantage from play, I gave my father a candid detail of the life I had been leading. As I recounted each transgression, I took care to cite some illustrious example in my justification, in order to palliate my own faults. "I lived," said I, "with a mistress without the solemnity of marriage. The Duke of keeps two before the eyes of all Paris. Monsieur D has had one now for 10 years, and loves her with a fidelity which he has never shown to his wife. 2/3 of the men of fashion in Paris keep mistresses. I certainly have on 1 or 2 occasions cheated at play. Well, the Marquis of and the Count have no other source of revenue. The Prince of and the Duke of are at the head of a gang of the same industrious order. As for the designs I had upon the pockets of the 2 G.M.'s, I might just as easily have proved that I had abundant models for that also, but I had too much pride to plead guilty to this charge, and rest on the justification of example, so that I begged of my father to ascribe my weakness on this occasion to the violence of the two passions which agitated me, revenge and love. He asked me whether I could suggest any means of obtaining my liberty, and in such a way as to avoid publicity as much as possible. I told him of the kind feelings which the Lieutenant General of Police had expressed towards me. "If you encounter any obstacles," said I, "they will be offered only by the two G.M.'s, so that I think it would be advisable to call upon them." He promised to do so. I did not dare ask him to solicit Manon's liberation. This was not from want of courage, but from the apprehension of exasperating him by such a proposition, and perhaps driving him to form some design fatal to the future happiness of us both. It remains to this hour a problem whether this fear on my part was not the immediate cause of all my most terrible misfortunes, by preventing me from ascertaining my father's disposition, and endeavouring to inspire him with favourable feelings towards my poor mistress. I might have perhaps once more succeeded in exciting his commiseration. I might have put him on his guard against the impression which he was sure of receiving from a visit to old G.M. But how can I tell what the consequences would have been? My unhappy fate would have most probably counteracted all my efforts, but it would have been a consolation to have had nothing else but that, and the cruelty of my enemies, to blame for my afflictions. On quitting me, my father went to pay a visit to Monsieur G.M. He found him with his son, whom the guardsman had safely restored to liberty. I never learned the particulars of their conversation, but I could easily infer them from the disastrous results. They went together, the two old gentlemen, to the Lieutenant General of Police, from whom they requested one favour each. The first was to have me at once liberated from Le Châtelet. The second, to condemn Manon to perpetual imprisonment, or to transport her for life to America. They happened at that very period to be sending out a number of convicts to the Mississippi. The Lieutenant General promised to have her embarked on board the first vessel that sailed. Monsieur G.M. and my father came together to bring me the news of my liberation. Monsieur G.M. said something civil with reference to what had passed, and having congratulated me upon my happiness in having such a father, he exhorted me to profit henceforward by his instruction and example. My father desired me to express my sorrow for the injustice I had even contemplated against his family, and my gratitude for his having assisted in procuring my liberation. We all left the prison together, without the mention of Manon's name. I dared not in their presence speak of her to the turnkeys. Alas! all my entreaties in her favour would have been useless. The cruel sentence upon Manon had arrived at the same time as the warrant for my discharge. The unfortunate girl was conducted in an hour after to the hospital, to be there classed with some other wretched women who had been condemned to the same punishment. My father having forced me to accompany him to the house where he was residing, it was near 6 o'clock before I had an opportunity of escaping his vigilance. In returning to Le Châtelet, my only wish was to convey some refreshments to Manon, and to recommend her to the attention of the porter, for I had no hope of being permitted to see her, nor had I as yet had time to reflect on the best means of rescuing her. I asked for the porter. I had won his heart, as much by my liberality to him as by the mildness of my manner, so that, having a disposition to serve me, he spoke of Manon's sentence as a calamity which he sincerely regretted, since it was calculated to mortify me. I was at first unable to comprehend his meaning. We conversed for some minutes without my understanding him. At length, perceiving that an explanation was necessary, he gave me such a one as on a former occasion I wanted courage to relate to you, and which even now makes my blood curdle in my veins to remember. Footnote: who has e'er been at Paris must needs know the grave, the fatal retreat of the unfortunate brave, where honour and justice most oddly contribute to ease heroes' pains by the halter and gibbet. Prior. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Manon Lescaut by Abbe Prevost. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alack! It is not when we sleep soft and wake merrily that we think on other people's sufferings, but when the hour of trouble comes, said Jeanie Deans. Walter Scott. Never did apoplexy produce on mortal a more sudden or terrific effect than did the announcement of Manon's sentence upon me. I fell prostrate, with so intense a palpitation of the heart, that as I swooned, I thought that death itself was come upon me. This idea continued, even after I had been restored to my senses. I gazed around me upon every part of the room, then upon my own paralysed limbs, doubting in my delirium whether I still bore about me the attributes of a living man. It is quite certain that, in obedience to the desire I felt of terminating my sufferings, even by my own hand, nothing could have been to me more welcome than death at that moment of anguish and despair. Religion itself could depict nothing more insupportable after death than the racking agony with which I was then convulsed. Yet, by a miracle, only within the power of omnipotent love, I soon regained strength enough to express my gratitude to Heaven for restoring me to sense and reason. My death could have only been a relief and blessing to myself, whereas Manon had occasion for my prolonged existence, in order to deliver her, to succour her, to avenge her wrongs. I swore to devote that existence unremittingly to these objects. The porter gave me every assistance that I could have expected at the hands of my oldest friend. I accepted his services with the liveliest gratitude. "Alas!" said I to him, "you then are affected by my sufferings. The whole world abandons me. My own father proves one of the very cruellest of my persecutors. No person feels pity for me. You alone in this abode of suffering and shame, you alone exhibit compassion for the most wretched of mankind." He advised me not to appear in the street until I had recovered a little from my affliction. "Do not stop me," said I, as I went out. "We shall meet again sooner than you imagine. Get ready your darkest dungeon, for I shall shortly become its tenant." In fact, my first idea was nothing less than to make away with the 2 G.M.'s and the Lieutenant General of Police, and then to attack the hospital, sword in hand, assisted by all whom I could enlist in my cause. Even my father's life was hardly respected, so just appeared my feelings of vengeance, for the porter had informed me that he and G.M. were jointly the authors of my ruin. But when I had advanced some paces into the street, and the fresh air had cooled my excitement, I gradually viewed matters in a more rational mood. The death of our enemies could be of little use to Manon, and the obvious effect of such violence would be to deprive me of all other chance of serving her. Besides, could I ever bring myself to be a cowardly assassin? By what other means could I accomplish my revenge? I set all my ingenuity and all my efforts at work to procure the deliverance of Manon, leaving everything else to be considered hereafter, when I had succeeded in this first and paramount object. I had very little money left. Money, however, was an indispensable basis for all my operations. I only knew 3 persons from whom I had any right to ask pecuniary assistance: Monsieur de T, Tiberge, and my father. There appeared little chance of obtaining any from the 2 latter, and I was really ashamed again to importune Monsieur de T. But it is not in desperate emergencies that one stands upon points of ceremony. I went first to the seminary of Saint-Sulpice, without considering whether I should be recognized. I asked for Tiberge. His first words showed me that he knew nothing of my latest adventure. This made me change the design I had originally formed of appealing at once to his compassion. I spoke generally of the pleasure it had given me to see my father again, and I then begged of him to lend me some money, under the pretext of being anxious, before I left Paris, to pay a few little debts which I wished to keep secret. He handed me his purse without a single remark. I took 20 or 25 pounds which it contained. I offered him my note of hand, but he was too generous to accept it. I then went to Monsieur de T. I had no reserve with him. I plainly told him my misfortunes and distress. He already knew everything, and had informed himself even of the most trifling circumstance, on account of the interest he naturally took in young G M's adventure. He, however, listened to me, and seemed sincerely to lament what had occurred. When I consulted him as to the best means of rescuing Manon, he answered that he saw such little ground for hope, that without some extraordinary interposition of Providence, it would be folly to expect relief; that he had paid a visit expressly to the hospital since Manon had been transferred from the Châtelet, but that he could not even obtain permission to see her, as the Lieutenant General of Police had given the strictest orders to the contrary; and that, to complete the catastrophe, the unfortunate train of convicts, in which she was to be included, was to take its departure from Paris the day but one after. I was so confounded by what he said, that if he had gone on speaking for another hour, I should not have interrupted him. He continued to tell me that the reason of his not calling to see me at the Châtelet was, that he hoped to be of more use by appearing to be unknown to me; that for the last few hours, since I had been set at liberty, he had in vain looked for me, in order to suggest the only plan through which he could see a hope of averting Manon's fate. He told me it was dangerous counsel to give, and implored me never to mention the part he took in it. It was to find some enterprising fellows gallant enough to attack Manon's guard on getting outside the barriere. Nor did he wait for me to urge a plea of poverty. "Here is 50 pounds," he said, presenting me his purse. "It may be of use to you. You can repay me when you are in better circumstances." He added that, if the fear of losing his character did not prevent him from embarking in such an enterprise, he would have willingly put his sword and his life at my service. This unlooked for generosity affected me to tears. I expressed my gratitude with as much warmth as my depressed spirits left at my command. I asked him if there were nothing to be expected from interceding with the Lieutenant General of Police. He said that he had considered that point, but that he looked upon it as a hopeless attempt, because a favour of that nature was never accorded without some strong motive, and he did not see what inducement could be held out for engaging the intercession of any person of power on her behalf; that if any hope could possibly be entertained upon the point, it must be by working a change in the feelings of old G M and my father, and by prevailing on them to solicit from the Lieutenant General of Police the revocation of Manon's sentence. He offered to do everything in his power to gain over the younger G M, although he fancied a coldness in that gentleman's manner towards him, probably from some suspicions he might entertain of his being concerned in the late affair, and he entreated me to lose no opportunity of effecting the desired change in my father's mind. This was no easy undertaking for me, not only on account of the difficulty I should naturally meet in overcoming his opinion, but for another reason which made me fear even to approach him. I had quitted his lodgings contrary to his express orders, and was resolved, since I had learned the sad fate of my poor Manon, never again to return thither. I was not without apprehensions, indeed, of his now retaining me against my will, and perhaps taking me at once back with him into the country. My elder brother had formerly had recourse to this violent measure. True, I was now somewhat older, but age is a feeble argument against force. I hit upon a mode, however, of avoiding this danger, which was to get him by contrivance to some public place, and there announce myself to him under an assumed name. I immediately resolved on this method. Monsieur de T went to G M's, and I to the Luxembourg, whence I sent my father word that a gentleman waited there to speak with him. I hardly thought he would come, as the night was advancing. He, however, soon made his appearance, followed by a servant. I begged of him to choose a walk where we could be alone. We walked at least 100 paces without speaking. He doubtless imagined that so much precaution could not be taken without some important object. He waited for my opening speech, and I was meditating how to commence it. At length I began. "Sir," said I, trembling, "you are a good and affectionate parent. You have loaded me with favours, and have forgiven me an infinite number of faults. I also, in my turn, call Heaven to witness the sincere and tender and respectful sentiments I entertain towards you. But it does seem to me that your inexorable severity—" "Well, sir, my severity!" interrupted my father, who no doubt found my hesitation little suited to his impatience. "Ah, sir," I replied, "it does seem to me that your severity is excessive in the penalty you inflict upon the unfortunate Manon. You have taken only Monsieur G M's report of her. His hatred has made him represent her to you in the most odious colours. You have formed a frightful idea of her. She is, on the contrary, the mildest and most amiable of living creatures. Would that Heaven had but inspired you at any one moment with the desire of seeing her! I am convinced that you would be not less sensible of her perfections than your unhappy son. You would then have been her advocate. You would have abhorred the foul artifices of G M. You would have had pity on both her and me. Alas, I am persuaded of it. Your heart is not insensible. It must ere now have melted with compassion." He interrupted me again, perceiving that I spoke with a warmth which would not allow me to finish very briefly. He begged to know with what request I intended to wind up so fervent an harangue. "To ask my life at your hands," said I, "which I never can retain, if Manon once embark for America." "No, no," replied he in the severest tone. "I would rather see you lifeless than infamous and depraved." "We have gone far enough then," said I, catching hold of his arm. "Take from me in common mercy my life, weary and odious and insupportable as it henceforward must be, for in the state of despair into which you now plunge me, death would be the greatest favour you could bestow. a favour worthy of a father's hand." "I should only give you what you deserve," replied he. "I know fathers who would not have shown as much patience as I have, but would themselves have executed speedy justice. But it is my foolish and excessive forbearance that has been your ruin." I threw myself at his feet. "Ah!" exclaimed I, "if you have still any remains of mercy, do not harden your heart against my distress and sorrow. Remember that I am your child. Alas! Think of my poor mother. You loved her tenderly. Would you have suffered her to be torn from your arms? You would have defended her to the death. May not the same feeling then be pardoned in others? Can persons become barbarous and cruel after having themselves experienced the softening influence of tenderness and grief?" "Breathe not again the sacred name of your mother," he exclaimed in a voice of thunder. "The very allusion to her memory rouses my indignation. Had she lived to witness the unredeemed profligacy of your life, it would have brought her in pain and sorrow to her grave. Let us put an end to this discussion," he added. "It distresses me, and makes not the slightest change in my determination. I am going back to my lodgings, and I desire you to follow me." The cool and resolute tone in which he uttered this command convinced me that he was inexorable. I stepped some paces aside, for fear he should think fit to lay hands upon me. "Do not increase my misery and despair," said I to him, "by forcing me to disobey you. It is impossible for me to follow you, and equally so that I should continue to live after the unkind treatment I have experienced from you. I therefore bid you an eternal adieu. When you know that I am dead, as I shall soon be, the paternal affection which you once entertained for me may be perhaps revived." As I was about to turn away from him, "You refuse then to follow me?" cried he in a tone of excessive anger. "Go, go on to your ruin. Adieu, ungrateful and disobedient boy." "Adieu," exclaimed I to him in a burst of grief. "Adieu, cruel and unnatural father." I left the Luxembourg, and rushed like a madman through the streets to M. de T 's house. I raised my hands and eyes as I went along, invoking the Almighty powers. "O Heaven!" cried I, "will you not prove more merciful than man? The only hope that remains to me is from above." M. de T had not yet returned home, but he arrived before many minutes had elapsed. His negotiation had been as unsuccessful as my own. He told me so with the most sorrowful countenance. Young G M, although less irritated than his father against Manon and me, would not undertake to petition in our favour. He was, in great measure, deterred by the fear which he himself had of the vindictive old lecher, who had already vented his anger against him for his design of forming a connection with Manon. There only remained to me, therefore, the violent measures which M. T had suggested. I now confined all my hopes to them. They were, questionless, most uncertain, but they held out to me at least a substantial consolation in the certainty of meeting death in the attempt, if unsuccessful. I left him, begging that he would offer up his best wishes for my triumph, and I thought only of finding some companions to whom I might communicate a portion of my own courage and determination. The first that occurred to me was the same guardsman whom I had employed to arrest G M. I had intended indeed to pass the night at his rooms, not having had a moment of leisure during the afternoon to procure myself a lodging. I found him alone. He was glad to see me out of the Châtelet. He made me an offer of his services. I explained to him in what way he might now do me the greatest kindness. He had good sense enough to perceive all the difficulties, but he was also generous enough to undertake to surmount them. We spent part of the night in considering how the plot was to be executed. He spoke of the 3 soldiers whom he had made use of on the last occasion, as men whose courage had been proved. Monsieur de T had told me the exact number of archers that would escort Manon. They were but 6. 5 strong and determined men could not fail to strike terror into these fellows, who would never think of defending themselves bravely, when they were to be allowed the alternative of avoiding danger by surrendering, and of that they would no doubt avail themselves. As I was not without money, the guardsman advised me to spare no pains or expense to ensure success. "We must be mounted," he said, "and each man must have his carbine and pistols. I will take care to prepare everything requisite by tomorrow. We shall also want 3 new suits of regimentals for the soldiers, who dare not appear in an affray of this kind in the uniform of their regiment." I handed him the 100 pistoles which I had got from Monsieur de T. It was all expended the next morning, to the very last sou. I inspected the 3 soldiers. I animated them with the most liberal promises, and to confirm their confidence in me, I began by making each man a present of 10 pistoles. The momentous day having arrived, I sent one of them at an early hour to the hospital, to ascertain the exact time when the police were to start with their prisoners. Although I merely took this precaution from my excessive anxiety, it turned out to have been a prudent step. I had formed my plans upon false information, which I had received as to their destination, and believing that it was at Rochelle this unhappy group was to embark, all my trouble would have been thrown away in waiting for them on the Orleans road. However, I learned by the soldier's report that they would go out towards Rouen, and that it was from Havre de Grace they were to sail for America. We at once went to the gate of Saint Honore, taking care to go by different streets. We assembled at the end of the faubourg. Our horses were fresh. In a little time we observed before us the 6 archers and the 2 wretched caravans, which you saw at Passy 2 years ago. The sight alone almost deprived me of my strength and senses. "Oh, fate!" said I to myself, "cruel fate! Grant me now either death or victory." We hastily consulted as to the mode of making the attack. The cavalcade was only 400 paces in advance, and we might intercept them by cutting across a small field, round which the high road led. The guardsman was for this course, in order to fall suddenly upon them while unprepared. I approved of the plan, and was the first to spur my horse forward. But fate once again relentlessly blasted all my hopes. The escort, seeing 5 horsemen riding towards them, inferred that it was for the purpose of attacking them. They put themselves in a position of defence, preparing their bayonets and guns with an air of resolution. This demonstration, which in the guardsman and myself only inspired fresh courage, had a very different effect upon our 3 cowardly companions. They stopped simultaneously, and having muttered to each other some words which I could not hear, they turned their horses' heads, threw the bridles on their necks, and galloped back towards Paris. "Good heavens!" said the guardsman, who appeared as much annoyed as I was by this infamous desertion. "What is to be done? We are but 2 now." From rage and consternation I had lost all power of speech. I doubted whether my first revenge should not be in pursuing the cowards who had abandoned me. I saw them flying, and looked in the other direction at the escort. If it had been possible to divide myself, I should at once have fallen upon both these objects of my fury. I should have destroyed all at the same moment. The guardsman, who saw my irresolution by my wandering gaze, begged of me to hear his advice. "Being but two," he said, "it would be madness to attack 6 men, as well armed as ourselves, and who seem determined to receive us firmly. Let us return to Paris, and endeavour to succeed better in the choice of our comrades. The police cannot make very rapid progress with 2 heavy vans. We may overtake them tomorrow without difficulty." I reflected a moment on this suggestion, but seeing nothing around me but despair, I took a final and indeed desperate resolution. This was to thank my companion for his services, and, far from attacking the police, to go up with submission and implore them to receive me among them, that I might accompany Manon to Havre de Grace, and afterwards, if possible, cross the Atlantic with her. "The whole world is either persecuting or betraying me," said I to the guardsman. "I have no longer the power of interesting any one in my favour. I expect nothing more either from fortune or the friendship of man. My misery is at its height. It only remains for me to submit, so that I close my eyes henceforward against every gleam of hope. May Heaven," I continued, "reward you for your generosity. Adieu! I shall go and aid my wretched destiny in filling up the full measure of my ruin." He in vain endeavoured to persuade me to return with him to Paris. I entreated him to leave me at once, lest the police should still suspect us of an intention to attack them. Chapter 12 of Manon Lescaut by Abbe Prevost. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The pauses and intermissions of pain become positive pleasures, and have thus a power of shedding a satisfaction over the intervals of ease, which few enjoyments exceed. Paley. Riding towards the cortege at a slow pace, and with a sorrowful countenance, the guards could hardly see anything very terrific in my approach. They seemed, however, to expect an attack. "Be persuaded, gentlemen," said I to them, "that I come not to wage war, but rather to ask favours." I then begged of them to continue their progress without any distrust, and as we went along I made my solicitations. They consulted together to ascertain in what way they should entertain my request. The chief of them spoke for the rest. He said that the orders they had received to watch the prisoners vigilantly were of the strictest kind. That, however, I seemed so interesting a young man, that they might be induced to relax a little in their duty, but that I must know, of course, that this would cost me something. I had about 16 pistoles left, and candidly told them what my purse contained. "Well," said the gendarme, "we will act generously. It shall only cost you 1 crown an hour for conversing with any of our girls that you may prefer. That is the ordinary price in Paris." I said not a word of Manon, because I did not wish to let them know of my passion. They at first supposed it was merely a boyish whim that made me think of amusing myself with these creatures; but when they discovered that I was in love, they increased their demands in such a way that my purse was completely empty on leaving Mantes, where we had slept the night before our arrival at Passy. Shall I describe to you my heart-rending interviews with Manon during this journey, and what my sensations were when I obtained from the guards permission to approach her caravan? Oh, language never can adequately express the sentiments of the heart. But picture to yourself my poor mistress, with a chain round her waist, seated upon a handful of straw, her head resting languidly against the panel of the carriage, her face pale and bathed with tears, which forced a passage between her eyelids, although she kept them continually closed. She had not even the curiosity to open her eyes on hearing the bustle of the guards when they expected our attack. Her clothes were soiled and in disorder, her delicate hands exposed to the rough air. In fine, her whole angelic form, that face, lovely enough to carry back the world to idolatry, presented a spectacle of distress and anguish utterly indescribable. I spent some moments gazing at her as I rode alongside the carriage. I had so lost my self-possession that I was several times on the point of falling from my horse. My sighs and frequent exclamations at length attracted her attention. She looked at and recognised me, and I remarked that on the first impulse she unconsciously tried to leap from the carriage towards me, but being checked by her chain, she fell into her former attitude. I begged of the guards to stop one moment for the sake of mercy. They consented for the sake of avarice. I dismounted to go and sit near her. She was so languid and feeble that she was for some time without the power of speech, and could not raise her hands. I bathed them with my tears, and being myself unable to utter a word, we formed together as deplorable a picture of distress as could well be seen. When at length we were able to speak, our conversation was not less sorrowful. Manon said little. Shame and grief appeared to have altered the character of her voice. Its tone was feeble and tremulous. She thanked me for not having forgotten her, and for the comfort I gave her in allowing her to see me once more, and she then bade me a long and last farewell. But when I assured her that no power on earth could ever separate me from her, and that I was resolved to follow her to the extremity of the world, to watch over her, to guard her, to love her, and inseparably to unite my wretched destiny with hers, the poor girl gave way to such feelings of tenderness and grief that I almost dreaded danger to her life from the violence of her emotion. The agitation of her whole soul seemed intensely concentrated in her eyes. She fixed them steadfastly upon me. She more than once opened her lips without the power of giving utterance to her thoughts. I could, however, catch some expressions that dropped from her, of admiration and wonder at my excessive love, of doubt that she could have been fortunate enough to inspire me with a passion so perfect, of earnest entreaty that I would abandon my intention of following her, and seek elsewhere a lot more worthy of me, and which, she said, I could never hope to find with her. In spite of the cruellest inflictions of fate, I derived comfort from her looks, and from the conviction that I now possessed her undivided affection. I had, in truth, lost all that other men value, but I was the master of Manon's heart, the only possession that I prized. Whether in Europe or in America, of what moment to me was the place of my abode, provided I might live happy in the society of my mistress? Is not the universe the residence of two fond and faithful lovers? Does not each find in the other father, mother, friends, relations, riches, felicity? If anything caused me uneasiness, it was the fear of seeing Manon exposed to want. I fancied myself already with her in a barbarous country, inhabited by savages. "I am quite certain," said I, "there will be none there more cruel than G M and my father. They will at least allow us to live in peace. If the accounts we read of savages be true, they obey the laws of nature. They neither know the mean rapacity of avarice, nor the false and fantastic notions of dignity, which have raised me up an enemy in my own father. They will not harass and persecute two lovers, when they see us adopt their own simple habits. I was therefore at ease upon that point. But my romantic ideas were not formed with a proper view to the ordinary wants of life. I had too often found that there were necessaries which could not be dispensed with, particularly by a young and delicate woman, accustomed to comfort and abundance. I was in despair at having so fruitlessly emptied my purse, and the little money that now remained was about being forced from me by the rascally imposition of the gendarmes. I imagined that a very trifling sum would suffice for our support for some time in America, where money was scarce, and might also enable me to form some undertaking there for our permanent establishment. This idea made me resolve on writing to Tiberge, whom I had ever found ready to hold out the generous hand of friendship. I wrote from the first town we passed through. I only alluded to the destitute condition in which I foresaw that I should find myself on arriving at Havre de Grace, to which place I acknowledged that I was accompanying Manon. I asked him for only 50 pistoles. "You can remit it to me," said I to him, "through the hands of the postmaster. You must perceive that it is the last time I can by possibility trespass on your friendly kindness, and my poor unhappy mistress being about to be exiled from her country for ever, I cannot let her depart without supplying her with some few comforts to soften the sufferings of her lot, as well as to assuage my own sorrows." The gendarmes became so rapacious when they saw the violence of my passion, continually increasing their demands for the slightest favours, that they soon left me penniless. Love did not permit me to put any bounds to my liberality. At Manon's side I was not master of myself, and it was no longer by the hour that time was measured, rather by the duration of whole days. At length, my funds being completely exhausted, I found myself exposed to the brutal caprice of these 6 wretches, who treated me with intolerable rudeness. You yourself witnessed it at Passy. My meeting with you was a momentary relaxation accorded me by fate. Your compassion at the sight of my sufferings was my only recommendation to your generous nature. The assistance which you so liberally extended enabled me to reach Havre, and the guards kept their promise more faithfully than I had ventured to hope. We arrived at Havre. I went to the post office. Tiberge had not yet had time to answer my letter. I ascertained the earliest day I might reckon upon his answer. It could not possibly arrive for 2 days longer, and by an extraordinary fatality, our vessel was to sail on the very morning of the day when the letter might be expected. I cannot give you an idea of my despair. "Alas!" cried I, "even amongst the unfortunate I am to be ever the most wretched." Manon replied, "Alas! does a life so thoroughly miserable deserve the care we bestow on ours? Let us die at Havre, dearest chevalier. Let death at once put an end to our afflictions. Shall we persevere, and go to drag on this hopeless existence in an unknown land, where we shall no doubt have to encounter the most horrible pains, since it has been their object to punish me by exile? Let us die," she repeated, "or do at least in mercy rid me of life, and then you can seek another lot in the arms of some happier lover." "No, no, Manon," said I, "it is but too enviable a lot, in my estimation, to be allowed to share your misfortunes." Her observations made me tremble. I saw that she was overpowered by her afflictions. I tried to assume a more tranquil air, in order to dissipate such melancholy thoughts of death and despair. I resolved to adopt the same course in future, and I learned by the results that nothing is more calculated to inspire a woman with courage than the demonstration of intrepidity in the man she loves. When I lost all hope of receiving the expected assistance from Tiberge, I sold my horse. The money it brought, joined to what remained of your generous gift, amounted to the small sum of 40 pistoles. I expended 8 in the purchase of some necessary articles for Manon, and I put the remainder by, as the capital upon which we were to rest our hopes and raise our fortunes in America. I had no difficulty in getting admitted on board the vessel. They were at the time looking for young men as voluntary emigrants to the colony. The passage and provisions were supplied gratis. I left a letter for Tiberge, which was to go by the post next morning to Paris. It was, no doubt, written in a tone calculated to affect him deeply, since it induced him to form a resolution which could only be carried into execution by the tenderest and most generous sympathy for his unhappy friend. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13, Part 1 of Manon Lescaut by Abbe Prevost. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sunt hi etiam sua proemia laudi, sunt lacrimae rerum, et mentem mortalia tangunt. Virgil. E'en the mute walls relate the victim's fame, and sinners' tears the good man's pity claim. Dryden. We set sail. The wind continued favourable during the entire passage. I obtained from the captain's kindness a separate cabin for the use of Manon and myself. He was so good as to distinguish us from the herd of our miserable associates. I took an opportunity, on the second day, of conciliating his attentions by telling him part of our unfortunate history. I did not feel that I was guilty of any very culpable falsehood in saying that I was the husband of Manon. He appeared to believe it, and promised me his protection, and indeed we experienced, during the whole passage, the most flattering evidences of his sincerity. He took care that our table was comfortably provided, and his attentions procured us the marked respect of our companions in misery. The unwearied object of my solicitude was to save Manon from every inconvenience. She felt this, and her gratitude, together with a lively sense of the singular position in which I had placed myself solely for her sake, rendered the dear creature so tender and impassioned, so attentive also to my most trifling wants, that it was between us a continual emulation of attentions and of love. I felt no regret at quitting Europe. On the contrary, the nearer we approached America, the more did I feel my heart expand and become tranquil. If I had not felt a dread of our perhaps wanting, by and by, the absolute necessaries of life, I should have been grateful to fate for having at length given so favourable a turn to our affairs. After a passage of 2 months, we at length reached the banks of the desired river. The country offered at first sight nothing agreeable. We saw only sterile and uninhabited plains, covered with rushes, and some trees rooted up by the wind. No trace either of men or animals. However, the captain having discharged some pieces of artillery, we presently observed a group of the inhabitants of New Orleans, who approached us with evident signs of joy. We had not perceived the town. It is concealed upon the side on which we approached it by a hill. We were received as persons dropped from the clouds. The poor inhabitants hastened to put 1,000 questions to us upon the state of France, and of the different provinces in which they were born. They embraced us as brothers, and as beloved companions, who had come to share their pains and their solitude. We turned towards the town with them, but we were astonished to perceive, as we advanced, that what we had hitherto heard spoken of as a respectable town was nothing more than a collection of miserable huts. They were inhabited by 500 or 600 persons. The governor's house was a little distinguished from the rest by its height and its position. It was surrounded by some earthen ramparts and a deep ditch. We were first presented to him. He continued for some time in conversation with the captain, and then, advancing towards us, he looked attentively at the women, one after another. There were 30 of them, for another troop of convicts had joined us at Havre. After having thus inspected them, he sent for several young men of the colony, who were desirous to marry. He assigned the handsomest women to the principal of these, and the remainder were disposed of by lot. He had not yet addressed Manon, but having ordered the others to depart, he made us remain. "I learn from the captain," said he, "that you are married, and he is convinced by your conduct on the passage that you are both persons of merit and of education. I have nothing to do with the cause of your misfortunes. But if it be true that you are as conversant with the world and society as your appearance would indicate, I shall spare no pains to soften the severity of your lot, and you may on your part contribute towards rendering this savage and desert abode less disagreeable to me." I replied in the manner which I thought best calculated to confirm the opinion he had formed of us. He gave orders to have a habitation prepared for us in the town, and detained us to supper. I was really surprised to find so much politeness in a governor of transported convicts. In the presence of others, he abstained from inquiring about our past adventures. The conversation was general, and in spite of our degradation, Manon and I exerted ourselves to make it lively and agreeable. At night we were conducted to the lodging prepared for us. We found a wretched hovel composed of planks and mud, containing 3 rooms on the ground and a loft overhead. He had sent there 6 chairs and some few necessaries of life. Manon appeared frightened by the first view of this melancholy dwelling. It was on my account, much more than upon her own, that she distressed herself. When we were left to ourselves, she sat down and wept bitterly. I attempted at first to console her, but when she enabled me to understand that it was for my sake she deplored our privations, and that in our common afflictions she only considered me as the sufferer, I put on an air of resolution, and even of content, sufficient to encourage her. "What is there in my lot to lament?" said I. "I possess all that I have ever desired. You love me, Manon, do you not? What happiness beyond this have I ever longed for? Let us leave to Providence the direction of our destiny. It by no means appears to me so desperate. The governor is civil and obliging. He has already given us marks of his consideration. He will not allow us to want for necessaries. As to our rude hut and the squalidness of our furniture, you might have noticed that there are few persons in the colony better lodged or more comfortably furnished than we are. And then you are an admirable chemist," added I, embracing her. "You transform everything into gold." "In that case," she answered, "you shall be the richest man in the universe; for, as there never was love surpassing yours, so it is impossible for man to be loved more tenderly than you are by me. I well know," she continued, "that I have never merited the almost incredible fidelity and attachment which you have shown for me. I have often caused you annoyances, which nothing but excessive fondness could have induced you to pardon. I have been thoughtless and volatile, and even while loving you, as I have always done, to distraction, I was never free from a consciousness of ingratitude. But you cannot believe how much my nature is altered. Those tears which you have so frequently seen me shed since quitting the French shore, have not been caused by my own misfortunes. Since you began to share them with me, I have been a stranger to selfishness. I only wept from tenderness and compassion for you. I am inconsolable of the thought of having given you one instant's pain during my past life. I never cease upbraiding myself with my former inconstancy, and wondering at the sacrifices which love has induced you to make for a miserable and unworthy wretch, who could not, with the last drop of her blood, compensate for half the torments she has caused you." Her grief, the language, and the tone in which she expressed herself, made such an impression that I felt my heart ready to break in me. "Take care," said I to her, "take care, dear Manon. I have not strength to endure such exciting marks of your affection. I am little accustomed to the rapturous sensations which you now kindle in my heart. Oh Heaven!" cried I have now nothing further to ask of you. I am sure of Manon's love. That has been alone wanting to complete my happiness. I can now never cease to be happy. My felicity is well secured." "It is indeed," she replied, "if it depends upon me, and I well know where I can be ever certain of finding my own happiness centred." With these ideas, capable of turning my hut into a palace worthy of earth's proudest monarch, I lay down to rest. America appeared to my view the true land of milk and honey, the abode of contentment and delight. People should come to New Orleans, I often said to Manon, who wish to enjoy the real rapture of love. It is here that love is divested of all selfishness, all jealousy, all inconstancy. Our countrymen come here in search of gold. They little think that we have discovered treasures of inestimably greater value. We carefully cultivated the governor's friendship. He bestowed upon me, a few weeks after our arrival, a small appointment which became vacant in the fort. Although not one of any distinction, I gratefully accepted it as a gift of Providence, as it enabled me to live independently of others' aid. I took a servant for myself and a woman for Manon. Our little establishment became settled. Nothing could surpass the regularity of my conduct or that of Manon. We lost no opportunity of serving or doing an act of kindness to our neighbours. This friendly disposition and the mildness of our manners secured us the confidence and affection of the whole colony. We soon became so respected that we ranked as the principal persons in the town after the governor. The simplicity of our habits and occupations, and the perfect innocence in which we lived, revived insensibly our early feelings of devotion. Manon had never been an irreligious girl, and I was far from being one of those reckless libertines who delight in adding impiety and sacrilege to moral depravity. All the disorders of our lives might be fairly ascribed to the natural influences of youth and love. Experience had now begun with us to do the office of age. It produced the same effect upon us as years must have done. Our conversation, which was generally of a serious turn, by degrees engendered a longing for virtuous love. I first proposed this change to Manon. I knew the principles of her heart. She was frank and natural in all her sentiments, qualities which invariably predispose to virtue. I said to her that there was but one thing wanting to complete our happiness. "It is," said I, "to invoke upon our union the benediction of Heaven. We have both of us hearts too sensitive and minds too refined to continue voluntarily in the wilful violation of so sacred a duty. It signifies nothing our having lived while in France in such a manner, because there it was as impossible for us not to love as to be united by a legitimate tie. But in America, where we are under no restraint, where we owe no allegiance to the arbitrary distinctions of birth and aristocratic prejudice, where, besides, we are already supposed to be married, why should we not actually become so? Why should we not sanctify our love by the holy ordinances of religion. As for me," I added, "I offer nothing new in offering you my hand and my heart, but I am ready to ratify it at the foot of the altar." This speech seemed to inspire her with joy. "Would you believe it," she replied, "I have thought of this 1,000 times since our arrival in America. The fear of annoying you has kept it shut up in my breast. I felt that I had no pretensions to aspire to the character of your wife." "Ah, Manon," said I, "you should very soon be a sovereign's consort, if I had been born to the inheritance of a crown. Let us not hesitate, we have no obstacle to impede us. I will this day speak to the governor on the subject, and acknowledge that we have in this particular hitherto deceived him. Let us leave," added I, "to vulgar lovers the dread of the indissoluble bonds of marriage. They would not fear them if they were assured as we are of the continuance of those of love." I left Manon enchanted by this resolution. I am persuaded that no honest man could disapprove of this intention in my present situation; that is to say, fatally enslaved as I was by a passion which I could not subdue, and visited by compunction and remorse which I ought not to stifle. But will any man charge me with injustice or impiety, if I complain of the rigour of Heaven in defeating a design that I could only have formed with the view of conciliating its favour and complying with its decrees? Alas! do I say defeated? Nay, punished as a new crime. I was patiently permitted to go blindly along the high road of vice, and the cruellest chastisements were reserved for the period when I was returning to the paths of virtue. I now fear that I shall have hardly fortitude enough left to recount the most disastrous circumstances that ever occurred to any man. I waited upon the governor, as I had settled with Manon, to procure his consent to the ceremony of our marriage. I should have avoided speaking to him, or to any other person upon the subject, if I had imagined that his chaplain, who was the only minister in the town, would have performed the office for me without his knowledge; but not daring to hope that he would do so privately, I determined to act ingenuously in the matter. The governor had a nephew named Synnelet, of whom he was particularly fond. He was about 30, brave, but of a headstrong and violent disposition. He was not married. Manon's beauty had struck him on the first day of our arrival, and the numberless opportunities he had of seeing her during the last 9 or 10 months had so inflamed his passion that he was absolutely pining for her in secret. However, as he was convinced, in common with his uncle and the whole colony, that I was married, he put such a restraint upon his feelings that they remained generally unnoticed, and he lost no opportunity of showing the most disinterested friendship for me. He happened to be with his uncle when I arrived at the government house. I had no reason for keeping my intention a secret from him, so that I explained myself without hesitation in his presence. The governor heard me with his usual kindness. I related to him a part of my history, to which he listened with evident interest, and when I requested his presence at the intended ceremony, he was so generous as to say that he must be permitted to defray the expenses of the succeeding entertainment. I retired perfectly satisfied. In an hour after, the chaplain paid me a visit. I thought he was come to prepare me by religious instruction for the sacred ceremony; but after a cold salutation, he announced to me in 2 words that the governor desired I would relinquish all thoughts of such a thing, for that he had other views for Manon. "Other views for Manon!" said I, as I felt my heart sink within me. "What views then can they be, chaplain?" He replied that I must be of course aware that the governor was absolute master here; that Manon, having been transported from France to the colony, was entirely at his disposal; that hitherto he had not exercised his right, believing that she was a married woman, but that now, having learned from my own lips that it was not so, he had resolved to assign her to Monsieur Synnelet, who was passionately in love with her. My indignation overcame my prudence. Irritated as I was, I desired the chaplain instantly to quit my house, swearing at the same time that neither Governor, Synnelet, nor the whole colony together should lay hands upon my wife, or mistress if they chose so to call her. I immediately told Manon of the distressing message I had just received. We conjectured that Synnelet had warped his uncle's mind after my departure, and that it was all the effect of a premeditated design. They were, questionless, the stronger party. We found ourselves in New Orleans as in the midst of the ocean, separated from the rest of the world by an immense interval of space, in a country perfectly unknown, a desert, or inhabited, if not by brutes, at least by savages quite as ferocious. To what corner could we fly? I was respected in the town, but I could not hope to excite the people in my favour to such a degree as to derive assistance from them, proportioned to the impending danger. Money was requisite for that purpose, and I was poor. Besides, the success of a popular commotion was uncertain, and if we failed in the attempt, our doom would be inevitably sealed. I revolved these thoughts in my mind. I mentioned them in part to Manon. I found new ones without waiting for her replies. I determined upon one course, and then abandoned that to adopt another. I talked to myself, and answered my own thoughts aloud. At length I sank into a kind of hysterical stupor that I can compare to nothing, because nothing ever equalled it. Manon observed my emotion, and from its violence judged how imminent was our danger, and apprehensive more on my account than on her own, the dear girl could not even venture to give expression to her fears. After a multitude of reflections, I resolved to call upon the governor, and appeal to his feelings of honour, to the recollection of my unvarying respect for him, and the marks he had given of his own affection for us both. Manon endeavoured to dissuade me from this attempt. She said, with tears in her eyes, "You are rushing into the jaws of death. They will murder you. I shall never again see you. I am determined to die before you." I had great difficulty in persuading her that it was absolutely necessary that I should go, and that she should remain at home. I promised that she should see me again in a few moments. She did not foresee, nor did I, that it was against herself the whole anger of heaven and the rabid fury of our enemies was about to be concentrated. I went to the fort. The governor was there with his chaplain. I supplicated him in a tone of humble submission that I could have ill brooked under other circumstances. I invoked his clemency by every argument calculated to soften any heart less ferocious and cruel than a tiger's. The barbarian made to all my prayers but 2 short answers, which he repeated over and over again. Manon, he said, was at his disposal, and he had given a promise to his nephew. I was resolved to command my feelings to the last. I merely replied that I had imagined he was too sincerely my friend to desire my death, to which I would infinitely rather consent than to the loss of my mistress. I felt persuaded on quitting him that it was folly to expect anything from the obstinate tyrant, who would have damned himself 100 times over to please his nephew. However, I persevered in restraining my temper to the end, deeply resolved, if they persisted in such flagrant injustice, to make America the scene of one of the most horrible and bloody murders that even love had ever led to. I was, on my return home, meditating upon this design, when fate, as if impatient to expedite my ruin, threw Synnelet in my way. He read in my countenance a portion of my thoughts. I before said he was brave. He approached me. "Are you not seeking me?" he inquired. "I know that my intentions have given you mortal offence, and that the death of one of us is indispensable. Let us see who is to be the happy man." I replied that such was unquestionably the fact, and that nothing but death could end the difference between us. We retired about 100 paces out of the town. We drew. I wounded and disarmed him at the first onset. He was so enraged that he peremptorily refused either to ask his life or renounce his claims to Manon. I might have been perhaps justified in ending both by a single blow, but noble blood ever vindicates its origin. I threw him back his sword. "Let us renew the struggle," said I to him, "and remember that there shall be now no quarter." He attacked me with redoubled fury. I must confess that I was not an accomplished swordsman, having had but 3 months' tuition in Paris. Love, however, guided my weapon. Synnelet pierced me through and through the left arm, but I caught him whilst thus engaged, and made so vigorous a thrust that I stretched him senseless at my feet. In spite of the triumphant feeling that victory, after a mortal conflict, inspires, I was immediately horrified by the certain consequences of his death. There could not be the slightest hope of either pardon or respite from the vengeance I had thus incurred. Aware as I was of the affection of the governor for his nephew, I felt perfectly sure that my death would not be delayed a single hour after his should become known. Urgent as this apprehension was, it still was by no means the principal source of my uneasiness. Manon, the welfare of Manon, the peril that impended over her, and the certainty of my being now at length separated from her, afflicted me to such a degree that I was incapable of recognising the place in which I stood. I regretted Synnelet's death. Instant suicide seemed the only remedy for my woes. However, it was this very thought that quickly restored me to my reason, and enabled me to form a resolution. "What," said I to myself, "die in order to end my pain? Then there is something I dread more than the loss of all I love. No, let me suffer the cruellest extremities in order to aid her, and when these prove of no avail, fly to death as a last resort." I returned towards the town. On my arrival at home, I found Manon half dead with fright and anxiety. My presence restored her. I could not conceal from her the terrible accident that had happened. On my mentioning the death of Synnelet and my own wound, she fell in a state of insensibility into my arms. It was a quarter of an hour before I could bring her again to her senses. I was myself in a most deplorable state of mind. I could not discern the slightest prospect of safety for either of us. "Manon," said I to her, when she had recovered a little, "what shall we do? Alas, what hope remains to us? I must necessarily fly. Will you remain in the town? Yes, dearest Manon, do remain. You may possibly still be happy here, while I, far away from you, may seek death and find it amongst the savages or the wild beasts." She raised herself in spite of her weakness, and taking hold of my hand to lead me towards the door, "Let us," said she, "fly together. We have not a moment to lose. Synnelet's body may be found by chance, and we shall then have no time to escape." "But, dear Manon," replied I, "to what place can we fly? Do you perceive any resource? Would it not be better that you should endeavour to live on without me, and that I should go and voluntarily place my life in the governor's hands?" This proposal had only the effect of making her more impatient for our departure. I had presence of mind enough on going out to take with me some strong liquors which I had in my chamber, and as much food as I could carry in my pockets. We told our servants, who were in the adjoining room, that we were going to take our evening walk, as was our invariable habit, and we left the town behind us more rapidly than I had thought possible from Manon's delicate state of health. Although I had not formed any resolve as to our future destination, I still cherished a hope, without which I should have infinitely preferred death to my suspense about Manon's safety. I had acquired a sufficient knowledge of the country, during nearly 10 months which I had now passed in America, to know in what manner the natives should be approached. Death was not the necessary consequence of falling into their hands. I had learned a few words of their language, and some of their customs, having had many opportunities of seeing them. Besides this sad resource, I derived some hopes from the fact that the English had, like ourselves, established colonies in this part of the New World. But the distance was terrific. In order to reach them, we should have to traverse deserts of many days' journey, and more than one range of mountains, so steep and vast as to seem almost impassable to the strongest man. I nevertheless flattered myself that we might derive partial relief from one or other of these sources. The savages might serve us as guides, and the English receive us in their settlements. We journeyed on as long as Manon's strength would permit, that is to say, about 6 miles. For this incomparable creature, with her usual absence of selfishness, refused my repeated entreaties to stop. Overpowered at length by fatigue, she acknowledged the utter impossibility of proceeding further. It was already night. We sat down in the midst of an extensive plain, where we could not even find a tree to shelter us. Her first care was to dress my wound, which she had bandaged before our departure. I in vain entreated her to desist from exertion. It would have only added to her distress if I had refused her the satisfaction of seeing me at ease and out of danger, before her own wants were attended to. I allowed her therefore to gratify herself, and in shame and silence submitted to her delicate attentions. But when she had completed her tender task, with what ardour did I not enter upon mine! I took off my clothes and stretched them under her, to render more endurable the hard and rugged ground on which she lay. I protected her delicate hands from the cold by my burning kisses and the warmth of my sighs. I passed the livelong night in watching over her as she slept, and praying Heaven to refresh her with soft and undisturbed repose. You can bear witness, just and all-seeing God, to the fervour and sincerity of those prayers, and thou alone knowest with what awful rigour they were rejected. You will excuse me if I now cut short a story which it distresses me beyond endurance to relate. It is, I believe, a calamity without parallel. I can never cease to deplore it. But although it continues, of course, deeply and indelibly impressed on my memory, yet my heart seems to shrink within me each time that I attempt the recital. We had thus tranquilly passed the night. I had fondly imagined that my beloved mistress was in a profound sleep, and I hardly dared to breathe lest I should disturb her. As day broke, I observed that her hands were cold and trembling. I pressed them to my bosom in the hope of restoring animation. This movement roused her attention, and making an effort to grasp my hand, she said in a feeble voice that she thought her last moments had arrived. I at first took this for a passing weakness, or the ordinary language of distress, and I answered with the usual consolations that love prompted. But her incessant sighs, her silence, and inattention to my inquiries, the convulsed grasp of her hands, in which she retained mine, soon convinced me that the crowning end of all my miseries was approaching. Do not now expect me to attempt a description of my feelings, or to repeat her dying expressions. I lost her. I received the purest assurances of her love, even at the very instant that her spirit fled. I have not nerve to say more upon this fatal and disastrous event. My spirit was not destined to accompany Manon's. Doubtless Heaven did not as yet consider me sufficiently punished, and therefore ordained that I should continue to drag on a languid and joyless existence. I willingly renounced every hope of leading a happy one. I remained for 24 hours without taking my lips from the still beauteous countenance and hands of my adored Manon. My intention was to await my own death in that position. But at the beginning of the second day, I reflected that after I was gone, she must of necessity become the prey of wild beasts. I then determined to bury her, and wait my own doom upon her grave. I was already, indeed, so near my end from the combined effect of long fasting and grief, that it was with the greatest difficulty I could support myself standing. I was obliged to have recourse to the liquors which I had brought with me, and these restored sufficient strength to enable me to set about my last sad office. From the sandy nature of the soil there was little trouble in opening the ground. I broke my sword and used it for the purpose, but my bare hands were of greater service. I dug a deep grave, and there deposited the idol of my heart, after having wrapped around her my clothes to prevent the sand from touching her. I kissed her 10,000 times, with all the ardour of the most glowing love, before I laid her in this melancholy bed. I sat for some time upon the bank, intently gazing on her, and could not command fortitude enough to close the grave over her. At length, feeling that my strength was giving way, and apprehensive of its being entirely exhausted before the completion of my task, I committed to the earth all that it had ever contained most perfect and peerless. I then lay myself with my face down upon the grave, and closing my eyes with the determination never again to open them, I invoked the mercy of Heaven, and ardently prayed for death. End of chapter 13, part 1. Chapter 13, part 2 of Manon Lescaut by Abbe Prevost. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. You will find it difficult to believe that during the whole time of this protracted and distressing ceremony, not a tear or a sigh escaped to relieve my agony. The state of profound affliction in which I was, and the deep settled resolution I had taken to die, had silenced the sighs of despair, and effectually dried up the ordinary channels of grief. It was thus impossible for me, in this posture upon the grave, to continue for any time in possession of my faculties. After what you have listened to, the remainder of my own history would ill repay the attention you seem inclined to bestow upon it. Synnelet having been carried into the town and skilfully examined, it was found that, so far from being dead, he was not even dangerously wounded. He informed his uncle of the manner in which the affray had occurred between us, and he generously did justice to my conduct on the occasion. I was sent for, and, as neither of us could be found, our flight was immediately suspected. It was then too late to attempt to trace me, but the next day and the following one were employed in the pursuit. I was found without any appearance of life upon the grave of Manon, and the persons who discovered me in this situation, seeing that I was almost naked and bleeding from my wounds, naturally supposed that I had been robbed and assassinated. They carried me into the town. The motion restored me to my senses. The sighs I heaved on opening my eyes and finding myself still amongst the living, showed that I was not beyond the reach of art. They were but too successful in its application. I was immediately confined as a close prisoner. My trial was ordered, and as Manon was not forthcoming, I was accused of having murdered her from rage and jealousy. I naturally related all that had occurred. Synnelet, though bitterly grieved and disappointed by what he heard, had the generosity to solicit my pardon. He obtained it. I was so reduced that they were obliged to carry me from the prison to my bed, and there I suffered for 3 long months under severe illness. My aversion from life knew no diminution. I continually prayed for death, and obstinately for some time refused every remedy. But Providence, after having punished me with atoning rigour, saw fit to turn to my own use its chastisements and the memory of my multiplied sorrows. It at length deigned to shed upon me its redeeming light, and revived in my mind ideas worthy of my birth and my early education. My tranquillity of mind being again restored, my cure speedily followed. I began only to feel the highest aspirations of honour, and diligently perform the duties of my appointment, whilst expecting the arrival of the vessels from France, which were always due at this period of the year. I resolved to return to my native country, there to expiate the scandal of my former life by my future good conduct. Synnelet had the remains of my dear mistress removed into a more hallowed spot. It was 6 weeks after my recovery, that one day walking alone upon the banks of the river, I saw a vessel arrive, which some mercantile speculation had directed to New Orleans. I stood by whilst the passengers landed. Judge my surprise on recognising Tiberge amongst those who proceeded towards the town. This ever faithful friend knew me at a distance, in spite of the ravages which care and sorrow had worked upon my countenance. He told me that the sole object of his voyage had been to see me once more, and to induce me to return with him to France; that on receipt of the last letter which I had written to him from Havre, he started for that place, and was himself the bearer of the succour which I solicited; that he had been sensibly affected on learning my departure, and that he would have instantly followed me, if there had been a vessel bound for the same destination; that he had been for several months endeavouring to hear of one in the various seaport towns, and that, having at length found one at St. Malo, which was weighing anchor for Martinique, he embarked in the expectation of easily passing from thence to New Orleans; that the St. Malo vessel having been captured by Spanish pirates and taken to one of their islands, he had contrived to escape; and that, in short, after many adventures, he had got on board the vessel which had just arrived, and at length happily attained his object. I was totally unable adequately to express my feelings of gratitude to this generous and unshaken friend. I conducted him to my house, and placed all I possessed at his service. I related to him every circumstance that had occurred to me since I left France, and in order to gladden him with tidings which I knew he did not expect, I assured him that the seeds of virtue which he had in former days implanted in my heart were now about to produce fruit, of which even he should be proud. He declared to me that this gladdening announcement more than repaid him for all the fatigue and trouble he had endured. We passed 2 months together at New Orleans, whilst waiting the departure of a vessel direct to France, and having at length sailed, we landed only a fortnight since at Havre de Grace. On my arrival I wrote to my family. By a letter from my elder brother I there learned my father's death, which, I dread to think, the disorders of my youth might have hastened. The wind being favourable for Calais, I embarked for this port, and am now going to the house of one of my relations, who lives a few miles off, where my brother said that he should anxiously await my arrival. Note. Some say that love, at sight of human ties, spreads his light wings, and in a moment flies. End of chapter 13, part 2. Recording by Mary Bard, Derby, England. End of Manon Lescaut by Abbe Prevost.